The Nazis weren't exactly shy about the fact that they didn't really care for individuals of a race other than the one they idealized. Further, the Japanese seemingly had no problem with peoples like the Jews, even going so far as in World War II taking in Jewish refugees from German-occupied lands. Further, unlike Germany's European allies during World War II, when the Nazis attempted to pressure Japan to join in on their anti-Jewish activities, the Japanese government not only didn't listen, but even had official policy in place explicitly prohibiting expelling any Jew from Japan or territories they occupied, a policy they maintained throughout the war, even as Jews who escaped from Nazi-occupied regions continued to flood into Japanese territories. Japanese diplomat Yasuke Matsuoka summed up, "I am the man responsible for the alliance with Hitler, but nowhere have I promised that we would carry out his anti-Semitic policies in Japan. This is not simply my personal opinion, it is the opinion of Japan, and I have no compunction about announcing it to the world." Given all this, it seems rather odd that Japan and Nazi Germany should sign a series of agreements with one another, culminating in the famous Tripartite Pact in 1940, which ultimately allied most famously Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan, but also eventually the likes of other countries such as Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, and for 2 whole days, Yugoslavia, all into the so-called coalition of Axis powers. More on the interesting reason Yugoslavia's joining only lasted 2 days in the bonus facts later on in today's video. So why did Japan join up with the Nazis? And for that matter, why did the Nazis want to join Japan not only so far away from their own country, but also populated by non-Aryans who not only couldn't have cared less about Nazi ideology, but actually pretty fundamentally disagreed with it? Now, before we get into any of that, as a point of clarification, despite popular perception, it's a major stretch to say that Japan and Germany were actually allies in anything but the most surface-level sense. In fact, outside of Hitler's eventual declaration of war against the United States shortly after Japan attacked the US, the two sides didn't really do much of anything of any use to support the other. Japan even refused to offer so much as economic concessions to Germany until 1943, with initial rejection stemming from the fact that Japan felt it would hurt their negotiations with the US in the early part of the war if they supported Germany in this way. This was more or less par for the course with the so-called alliance between the two nations, which really wasn't much of an alliance at all, or at least not anywhere close to the extent of the Allies, who, true to their name, on the whole actively coordinated their war efforts against their shared enemies. In contrast, Germany and Japan particularly more or less fought 2 separate wars, and even in times when they would have been well served to try and work together, as you'll soon see, they ended up not only but not even bothering to inform one another of their plans, which could drastically affect the other. That out of the way, let's dive into the particulars of how and why these two nations chose to, at least on the surface, join together, and how this ultimately ensured both of their defeats during World War II. To begin with, official German and Japanese relations were first established all the way back in 1861, before the German Empire technically existed, thanks to the Prussians, who helped form the German Empire about a decade later. The Prussians and the subsequent German Empire, among other Western influences, played a critical role in the extremely rapid modernization of Japan after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. In fact, pertinent to the topic at hand, one of Germany's greatest contributions to Japan was helping them modernize their military, with one of the German Empire representatives, Prussian General Jakob Merkel's efforts from 1885 to 1888 even so appreciated at the Army War College in Japan that they made a bronze statue of him. Not only that, but his doctrines, adopted by General Nogi Marisuke, are credited with helping Japan win the First Sino-Japanese War. By World War I, however, owing to Japan not exactly liking how various Western countries, including Germany, were encroaching on Asian interests, the two countries became explicit enemies, with Japan declaring war on Germany in 1914. Things got even more spicy directly after the war, when many of Germany's former Asian possessions were granted to Japan. By the mid-1920s, the two nations' relationship started to improve, however, and perhaps most critically for various reasons, about 80% of Japanese students studying abroad, many of whom were children of Japanese elites, chose German universities to study at. Also of note on this, many of the later key leaders of the movement to try and unite Asia under Japanese rule studied in Germany. Relations were further improved with the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1936, which was a pact between the two nations and later Italy, Spain, and Hungary to, at least publicly, even if nothing much came of it, counter the threat the Soviet Union and communism posed to the respective nations. It was at this point that things began heating up, thanks to the combination of the Soviet Union threat and the shared goals for expansion expansion the respective nations held, which very effectively alienated them from many of the other nations of the world and helped align their interests in their respective nations. Note here, Italy's plans on similar aggressive expansion at the time also alienated many nations of the world against them, such as in 1936 after Italy invaded Ethiopia, resulting in the United Nations imposing sanctions on them, in all helping to drive themselves, Germany and Japan together, despite not really having common goals exactly. As American ambassador to Japan, Joseph C. Grew stated in 1937, if the present triangular combination is analysed, it becomes immediately apparent that not only is the group not merely anti-communist, but that its policies and practices equally run counter to those of the so-called democratic powers. Thus, it can be seen that the question resolves itself into the simple fact that it is a combination of those states which are bent upon upsetting the status quo, as opposed to those states which wish to preserve the status quo, or more simply, of the have-nots against the haves, and that anti-communism is merely the banner under which the have-nots are rallying. As for this desire for expansion, as stated there at the time, much like the relatively young German Empire, Japan was interested in moving away from the so-called have-not nation status to the have status. During the Age of Discovery, many nations like Britain and France had taken advantage and expanded their empires around the globe, something both Japan and Germany had missed out on. Japan because of its isolationism, and the German Empire because it didn't exist until 1871, and its first bout of expansion after not just ended with World War I, but with much of their advancements on this front being taken away in the aftermath. On the Japanese side, given the rapid industrialization of Japan in the preceding century, Japan found itself in a situation of being a heavily industrialized nation that also had very little in the way of many of the resources needed to supply the industrialization engine. Thus, they had to rely on other nations to get them. For example, leading up to World War II, approximately 80% of Japan's oil supplies came from the United States, and another 14% from other nations, allowing the US to exert significant influence over Japan if it so wanted at any time. Matters weren't exactly greatly improved when looking at things like access to coal, rubber, iron, and other such staple resources. Thus, the Japanese were interested in copying the British, French, US, and other such nations and expanding their influence beyond their borders. They further felt that the Western expansion into various Asian nations was something of an affront that they could not allow to stand. Putting two and two together, the Japanese leaders felt an expansion would allow the Japanese empire to become more self-sufficient and in the process remove Western influence from Asian nations, installing their own nation as the head here naturally. This was not in many ways that different from Germany's own stated goal, seeking to expand their borders owing to the supposed living space problem, with Hitler stating, "We are overpopulated and cannot feed ourselves from our own resources." Previous efforts on the German front of expansion before World War I had seen Japan and Germany somewhat at odds, both wanting to expand into the same areas in East Asia. This time, however, Germany wanted Europe and was happy to leave Asia to the Japanese. On top of all of this, as previously alluded to, both nations had a vested interest in ceasing the spread of communism with the Soviet Union, so relatively close, and bordering nations, Germany and Japan, would both like to add to their future empires. On that note, if it were not for that anti-Soviet stance so staunchly held by the Germans and their long-term plans to attack the Soviets, World War II and the subsequent Cold War may have gone extremely differently. You see, a little talked about thing today is that the original Tripartite Pact came close to being a Quadpartite Pact. On this one, shortly before the Tripartite Pact was signed by Japan, Germany, and Italy, a fourth major power expressed their desire to join the fun, even making very favourable concessions to Germany, as well as rather sizable economic offerings. In perhaps one of the biggest blunders of the war, Germany didn't even bother to reply to the Soviet proposal to join, as Germany had already planned to invade, despite about a year before Germany signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviets. This pact, in a nutshell, was the two nations agreeing not to attack one another or aid an enemy of the other, as well as, in secret, defining various borders for the two nations in regions in between should either side, just so happen to, totally by coincidence, go to war in the area at some point, maybe. Had the Soviets been accepted into the Tripartite Pact, it would have not only allowed Germany to focus their full might against the British with their backs covered, but also given Germany better access to supplies from the Soviets and connecting over to their ally in Japan. On this one, perhaps allowing the Axis powers to eventually truly work together in the way the Allies did, instead of just being an alliance mostly on paper when it came to the Japanese and Germans. In any event, even though many of the German Empire and Japan's overarching goals for their nations aligned and their immediate plans didn't conflict with each other in any way, this still doesn't say why they actually, at least on paper, decided to publicly join forces. After all, as just alluded to, given the vast distance separating them, there was little hope that the two sides would benefit directly in the form of joining forces or even resources. And that is again, not to mention the whole fact that the Nazis weren't shy about noting any other race outside of Aryan was inferior in their view. As to that latter point, in true Nazi fashion, when reality conflicted with their stated ideologies and beliefs, they simply came up with their own version of reality to accommodate, from SS head Heinrich Himmler not himself meeting his own racial background requirements for all SS members not named Heinrich Himmler, to not just talking up the non-Aryan Japanese, but explicitly declaring them honorary Aryans, an expression that more or less meant that even though you aren't Aryan, we'll still consider and treat you as such. Hitler would even go so far as to publicly state admiration for the Chinese and the Japanese, noting pride in one's own race, and that does not imply contempt for other races, is also a normal and healthy sentiment. I have never regarded the Chinese or the Japanese as being inferior to ourselves. They belong to ancient civilizations, and I admit freely that their past history is superior to our own. They have the right to be proud of their past, just as we have the right to be proud of the civilization to which we belong. Indeed, I believe the more steadfast the Chinese and the Japanese remain in their pride of race, the easier I shall find it to get on with them. That said, he would also state, if we were to divide mankind into three groups, the founders of culture, the bearers of culture, the destroyers of culture, only the Aryan could be considered as the representative of the first group. From him originate the foundations and walls of all human creation, and only the outward form and color are determined by the changing traits of character of the various peoples. In a few decades, for example, the entire east of Asia will possess a culture whose ultimate foundation will be Hellenic spirit and Germanic technology, just as much as in Europe. Only the outward form, in part at least, will bear the features of Asiatic character. If beginning today all further Aryan influence on Japan should stop, assuming that Europe and America should perish, Japan's present rise in science and technology might continue for a short time, but even in a few years the well would dry up, the Japanese special character would gain, but the present culture would freeze and sink back into the slumber from which it was awakened 7 decades ago by the wave of Aryan culture. So, this was Hitler's mental gymnastics for being able to buddy up with the Japanese while supposedly still keeping to Nazi ideology. So what about from the Japanese perspective? In the general case, as noted by Carnegie Mellon's Ricky Law, author of Transnational Nazism, Ideology and Culture in German-Japanese Relations, 1919 to 1936, quote, I found that even before the government of Japan and Germany founded an alliance in 1936, intellectuals and commentators were publishing materials that put the other country in a positive light. Japanese intellectuals proactively reshaped Germany's ideals for Japanese consumption of Hitler and Nazism, keeping what they liked and removing what they didn't like. On that note, even though the Nazi Holocaust was well known and well reported throughout most regions of the world during World War II, as we previously covered, Japan was an exception, specifically suppressing any talk of German atrocities on this front. On their end, Germany did the same for Japan, suppressing any news of the so-called Asian Holocaust that saw Japan massacre somewhere between 3 to 13 million people in the process of supposedly liberating Asian nations. They also, during this time, conducted a truly horrific human experimentation on the peoples they conquered, and basically committed atrocities very similar in a lot of ways to the more well-known Holocaust on the German side. For example, enter Nazi Party member John Heinrich Raab, who found himself stationed in Nanjing in China in 1937 when the Japanese conquered it. Now, on this little story, I think we can all agree that when the Nazi comes across looking like the good guy, the other side should maybe pause and ask themselves, Hans, are these the bad guys? In this one, the Nazi Raab is credited with almost single-handedly saving the lives of tens of thousands of Chinese civilians thanks to his tireless efforts during the Nanjing massacre, which saw the Japanese forces slaughter between 50,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians, and wanting access to 250,000 or so more that Raab saw to it were protected from all of the raping and murdering. Going back to the story at hand, at how both sides were happy to cover up each other's atrocities with the public, Raab returned to Germany after the massacre with documentation of the mass murder, rape, beatings, etc., including photographs and film footage. He then began lecturing about all of this publicly, as well as attempting to get Hitler to pressure Japan to stop such appalling acts in China. As you might expect, this all not only fell on deaf ears, but saw Raab promptly arrested by the Gestapo. The company Siemens AG managed to step in and secure his release, but he was forbidden from speaking of this again. We will have more on the fascinating and rather tragic tale of John Raab in an upcoming video on our sister channel, Highlight History, so check that out. But to sum up here, in essence, both sides just reshaped the discourse about one another to fit their needs and make the other side look good, and the brass between the two nations seemed little inclined to be bothered that each side had some pretty fundamentally differing ideological views. All that background out of the way, this brings us back to why the Japanese and German empires would want to sign the Tripartite Pact. While nothing is black and white, and there are numerous things that went into it, including, as noted, the threat the Soviets still held for both nations' plans, despite other pacts leading up to the Tripartite Pact somewhat neutralizing that threat, ensured the United States had become a major problem. Germany and Japan were both looking for a way to keep the US out of their respective conflicts as much as possible, and wanted this pact to attempt to encourage this. Of this note, the Tripartite Pact was specifically worded to say that the signing nations would not be required to come to the other's aid unless they were attacked by some nation that the respective nations weren't currently already at war with. In other words, while not explicitly named, it's pretty clear this pact was directed squarely at the United States in a thinly veiled attempt to keep them from joining any of the war efforts on the other side. At the time, Germany was facing a stalemate with Britain and planning to invade the Soviets despite their little truce, and didn't want the US entering the fray on the side of Britain to tip the balance. As for Japan, it was already dealing with the US, whose people maybe had no interest in entering a war, but whose president very much didn't want to, and wasn't shy about speaking out against Japan's rather brutal expansion into China and the insane atrocities they committed doing this. On top of this, for the Germans, Japanese expansion into certain regions of Asia would also help tie down British forces and resources there. Further, once Japan was successful, this would potentially open up supplies from those regions to Germany from their Japanese ally. Likewise, from the Japanese side, with Germany doing its thing over in Europe, Britain would be too occupied to do much about their actions against British territories in the region. Thus, in essence, this pact was a warning to the US to stay out of their respective conflicts, and otherwise an opportunistic joining rather than one in which the two sides intended to support one another more directly from a military or resources standpoint. That said, Japan and Germany did have some token exchanges and little attempts to work together, such as Germany sending Japan one of its subs to take a look at and attempt to benefit from the design of. Unfortunately for Japan, they found it too complicated to replicate at the time, so little benefit came from this. Many other similar exchanges of technology and limited resources also occurred, but in all of these cases, the effect was almost entirely useless for the other side. On top of this, neither side really trusted the other very much, which perhaps shouldn't be a surprise, given the last pact they signed against communism saw Germany, without bothering to inform their ally the Japanese, sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviets. Ultimately, Japan had their own trick to play on the Germans, negotiating the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact in April of 1941, agreeing not to attack the Soviets, only to see the Japanese once again blindsided by their ally when Germany went the other way and decided to attack the Soviets 2 months later in June of 1941. Showing how little interest the two nations had of actually working together, after Germany attacked the Soviets, they began continually hinting that Germany would greatly appreciate it if Japan wouldn't mind being a good ally and switching efforts and attacking the Soviets as well. For example, Hitler stated to Japanese ambassador Hiroshi Oshima in 1941, "It would of course be up to Japan to act as it saw fit, but Japan's cooperation in the fight against the Soviet Union would be welcomed if the Japanese advance to the south should run into difficulty because of supply and equipment." Unfortunately for the Germans, when Japan had previously attempted to expand into the Soviet Union and protect its states, they were pretty brutally beaten back in a series of border conflicts, most devastatingly at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939. This cooled Japan's interest in any further expansion in that region. Thus, in the end, Japan made it very clear they would not go to war with the Soviet Union unless Germany had more or less already won the war against them. That said, Stalin wasn't banking on this continuing, and thus had to divide his forces to protect against Japan just in case. However, things took a drastic change in September of 1941 when Soviet spy Richard Sorge, fronting as a German journalist working for German ambassador to Tokyo Eugen Ott, sent a message that Japan absolutely would not attack the USSR unless first attacked, allowing a couple of dozen Soviet divisions in Siberia to be redistributed to the German side of the conflict and turning the tide of that war there. Unfortunately for Sorge, however, within a month of sending this message, he was unmasked and eventually executed. So that was the complete lack of coordination or even really communicating plans at all when it came to the Soviets. On the other ends of things, with the US, Japan did at least inform the Germans of their plan to go to war with the United States, though only giving them a heads up mere days before the attacks and not giving any specifics whatsoever on how or when they'd do this. On this note, you might now be wondering what on earth the Japanese were thinking trying to bring a nation into a war the Japanese military brass knew well they had zero chance of winning a protracted conflict against and could further completely shift the balance of the war for their their European allies. And just for reference here, for what it's worth, the gross domestic product of the United States was 17% higher than all Axis nations combined when the US entered the war. On top of that, neither Germany nor Japan had any hope of actually attacking the US mainland directly in any meaningful way. Further, as alluded to at the time, there was extremely strong support in the United States for isolationism following World War I, which resulted in the passing of various neutrality acts in the 1930s to help keep the US out of any foreign conflicts. These were initially only slightly undone in 1939 with the passing of certain acts like the one allowing the US to supply arms to Britain and France so long as they paid for them and also came and picked them up in their own ships. And then following this up in 1940 with trading 50 US destroyers to the British in exchange for various land rights in British-held regions, which technically violated the Neutrality Acts, but Roosevelt got away with it anyway. Then followed that up with the March of 1941 Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the US to give supplies and equipment to allied nations for free, in total about $50.1 billion. That's about $700 billion worth today. However, despite all of this, US citizens on the whole, along with many within the government, still had little interest in involving itself in the conflict with the Axis, even in these ways, let alone more directly by sending their sons to go and fight. Thus, both Japan and Germany's decision-making paradigms seem extremely questionable here, and indeed, ultimately their choices were catastrophic for their respective wars by deliberately waking the sleeping giants. So why did Japan attack the United States? In short, the United States forced them to. You see, once the Japanese efforts were mostly rebuffed on the northern expansion front by the Soviets, this left southern expansion, something they ultimately had to do because of the United States' actions leading up to Pearl Harbor. Going back a bit, the Japanese aggression into the likes of China and French Indochina and the atrocities the Japanese committed in those regions had seen the US, despite supposedly not wanting to be involved in foreign matters, nonetheless spearhead a series of progressively more harsh embargoes on Japan, ultimately cutting Japan off from needed supplies of oil, iron, rubber, steel, etc. For reference here, at the time, as mentioned before, 94% of Japan's oil supplies were imported, and 80% of that coming from the United States. After the embargo, it was noted by officials within the Imperial Japanese Navy that at that point they had perhaps as little as 6 months of campaigning before their ships would be dead in the water from lack of needed fuel, thus at that point forcing Japan to concede to whatever demands the US wanted to place on them to lift the embargo. They thus had three choices. First, negotiate a treaty with the US to get them to lift the embargo. Second, try again against the Soviets to capture those regions to get the resources they needed, and in this one support their ally in Germany. Or third, attack south, but into certain regions that were more or less protected by the US, and thus, in their view, would likely see the US declare war on them as a result. As for option number one of negotiating a treaty with the US to resolve this, they actually tried exceptionally hard at this, leading all the way up to mere hours before attacking Pearl Harbor. However, no such deal could be reached. That said, they did get pretty far along here, with Japan noting that they would agree to withdraw from French Indochina and not attack any regions of Southeast Asia, so long as all aid to China was lifted from Britain, the US and the Netherlands, and sanctions against Japan were likewise lifted. In essence, Japan was willing to give up most of their expansion plans and territories, but wanted to keep what they had captured of China and make war efforts a little easier for themselves. The US, however, rejected this proposal, requiring all Japan had offered, plus also that Japan would withdraw from China and sign non-aggression pacts with the various specific states. Essentially, the US stating, retreat back into your own country and abandon all plans of a true Japanese empire and self-sufficiency, as well as abandon plans to liberate Asia from Western influence like ourselves. In doing so, this would also once again make Japan subservient to the US and other nations because of the needed industrial supplies from them that Japan had no other access to. As you can imagine, given the US wasn't really conceding anything, this was a non-starter for Japanese leaders, something that it seems is exactly what the US officials were hoping for, to provoke Japan into conflict and thus hopefully allow the US to enter the war against Japan's supposed ally Germany. As for option two of attacking north against the Soviets, again, this was deemed too risky, given they had no real way to counter the Soviet tanks and, as mentioned, had been defeated so resoundingly there on this front in their previous attempt. This left option number three. Before their oil and other supplies ran out, expand south into the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, the Philippines, and elsewhere to acquire the resources they needed while also accomplishing the goal of beginning to establish the Japanese Empire and liberating these regions from Western influence. The problem here again was that to do so they were convinced would cause the US to declare war on them, with Japan then in a rather precarious position of not yet being fortified in the regions they were planning on taking, right when the US's Pacific Fleet would presumably quickly attack. Or at least they assumed they would. As you might expect, given wide support for isolationism at the time in the United States, historians debate whether the US actually would have or not had Japan just gone ahead and done it without attacking the US directly. On all of this, President Roosevelt explicitly stated that the US would not have, except he also believed that over the course of their activities in the region, the Japanese would make a mistake that he could leverage to drag the US into war with Japan and then Germany. As noted by Pacific Fleet Admiral James O. Richardson when he asked Roosevelt if the US would be going to war with Japan, he states, Roosevelt responded, "If the Japanese attacked Thailand or the Kra Peninsula or the Dutch East Indies, we would not enter the war. That if they even attacked the Philippines," noted the Philippines at the time were an American protectorate, he doubted whether we would enter the war, but that the Japanese could not always avoid making mistakes, and that as the war continued and that area of operations expanded, sooner or later they would make a mistake and would enter the war. Thus, if true, had the Japanese just went ahead and pushed south without directly involving the US, this is yet another point in World War II, much like when the Germans didn't let the Soviets join the Tripartite Pact, where things may have gone extremely differently both in the war in Europe and the Pacific had one decision been different. But, rightly or wrongly, the Japanese were convinced the US would declare war on them the second they attacked the Philippines and other nations in the region, something they had to do before they ran out of oil and other supplies because of US embargoes against Japan. So what to do about it, especially when they knew they couldn't win a war against the United States? How about sink the Pacific Fleet in a surprise attack, thus temporarily crippling the US's ability to retaliate while Japan simultaneously performs their own little blitzkrieg, taking over every nation they needed for the supplies and self-sufficiency they wanted, which is exactly what they did, for example, attacking the Philippines the next day after Pearl Harbor. They then would dig themselves in, such that it would require a massive effort by the United States to get them out. Something they knew the US could do, but Japanese leaders felt that the US would have no interest in such an effort given their general aversion to conflicts so far away. At that point, now from a much stronger negotiating position and dealing with a nation that wouldn't really want to continue the war, the Japanese could simply negotiate a truce with the United States that favored Japanese interests. It's foolproof. Obviously, all of this ended up being a huge miscalculation on the Japanese military brass's part on the reaction of Americans to the attack. This all wasn't helped via Roosevelt's speech about it, playing up the supposed alliance and coordinated efforts between Germany and Japan, further bolstering sentiment for the United States to enter the war against Germany in support of the British Empire. Roosevelt stated, "The course that Japan has followed for the past 10 years in Asia has paralleled the course of Hitler and Mussolini in Europe and in Africa. Today, it has become far more than a parallel. It is an actual collaboration so well calculated that all the continents of the world and all the oceans are now considered by the Axis strategists as one gigantic battlefield. In these past few years, and most violently in the past 3 days, we have learned a terrible lesson. It is our obligation to our dead, it is our sacred obligation to their children and to our children, that we must never forget what we have learned. And what we have all learned is this: there is no such thing as security for any nation or any individual in a world ruled by the principles of gangsterism. We are now in the midst of a war not for conquest, not for vengeance, but for a world in which this nation and all that this nation represents will be safe for our children. We expect to eliminate the danger from Japan, but it would serve us ill if we accomplished that and found that the rest of the world was dominated by Hitler and Mussolini." Speaking of Hitler, he went ahead and did Roosevelt a massive favor by almost immediately after Japan attacked, also declaring war on the United States in support of his Japanese allies, not just assuring the US would go to war with Germany, but also increasing public perception that the attack had somehow been coordinated and that the two nations were allies in more than just name. The second massive blunder in a week by the Axis powers. As historian Max Hastings notes, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler made the folly of the strike comprehensive by declaring war on the United States, relieving Roosevelt from a serious uncertainty about whether Congress would agree to fight Germany. As for the German side of things, let's just say that all this perhaps showed why plans to assassinate Hitler at one point were cancelled, because he was such an incompetent general that the war was sure to end with Allied victory if he was left in charge. Or as Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita had stated of Hitler, "He may be a great orator on a platform, but standing behind his desk listening, he seems much more like a clerk." On this note, Hitler's reaction to the surprise news of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was apparently, "We can't lose the war at all. We now have an ally which has never been conquered in 3,000 years. He also stated the Japanese strategy of a surprise attack. You gave them the right declaration of war. This method is the only proper one. Japan pursued it formally, and it corresponds with his own system. That is, to negotiate as long as possible. But if one sees that the other is interested only in putting one off, in shaming and humiliating one, and is not willing to come to an agreement, then one should strike as hard as possible and not waste time declaring war." Now, in a very slight defense of Hitler's decision here to declare war on the US instead of just waiting it out and seeing what happens, he had technically verbally promised Japan he would before the attack. It should be noted here that leading up to the attack, Japan had spearheaded an amendment to the Tripartite Pact wherein if any nation should not just be attacked by, but attack the United States, the other nations would be obligated also to go to war with the US. However, this amendment was not able to be completed before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Also noteworthy here, it would seem that there were efforts in the amending of the pact to oblige Japan to go to war with the USSR, but this was resoundingly rejected by Japan, with one communique from Japan to Berlin in December of 1941 stating, "In case Germany demands that we participate in the war against the Soviet Union, we will respond that we do not intend to join the war for the time being. If this should lead to a situation whereby Germany will delay her entry into the war against the United States, it cannot be helped." Yet Hitler did it anyway. So why? What was Hitler's more detailed reasoning for being excited Japan had brought arguably the most dangerous country not already in the war into the conflict? To begin with, Nazi politician Joseph Goebbels wrote of Hitler's thoughts at the time, "We are now to a certain extent protected on our flanks. The United States will probably no longer make aircraft, weapons and transport available to England so carelessly, as it can be assumed that they will need these for their own war against Japan." To be fair, this may have been what actually happened had, Hitler not declared war on the United States. In his speech announcing this historically catastrophic decision on December the 11th, 1941, he also doubled down on antagonizing his new enemy, taking potshots at the US and President Roosevelt, stating, "I will pass over the insulting attacks made by this so-called president against me. That he calls me a gangster is uninteresting. After all, this expression was not coined in Europe, but in America, no doubt because such gangsters are lacking here. National Socialism came to power in Germany in the same year as Roosevelt was elected president. While an unprecedented revival of economic life, culture, and art took place in Germany under National Socialist leadership, President Roosevelt did not succeed in bringing about even the slightest improvement in his own country. A threatening political opposition was gathering over the head of this man. He guessed that the only salvation for him lay in diverting public attention from home to foreign policy. He was strengthened in this by the Jews around him. The full diabolical meanness of Jewry rallied around this man, and he stretched out his hands. Thus began the increasing efforts of the American president to create conflicts. For years, this man harbored one desire, that a conflict should break out somewhere in the world. The fact that the Japanese government, which has been negotiating for years with this man, has at last become tired of being mocked by him in such an unworthy way, fills us all, the German people, and I think all other decent people in the world, with deep satisfaction. It was also noted that Hitler was happy that he could now actually have his U-boats openly attack US shipping lines that were supporting the Allies at the time, and he assumed that with the conflict in the Pacific, the US would have their hands full with much of their navy there, further making such supply lines on the European front vulnerable. While there were certainly pros from the German front, there were also a massive amount of very obvious cons that he didn't seem to factor in at all, such as the subsequent influx of US troops he'd soon have to meet on the battlefield. On this one, he appears to have simply been delusional, noting US soldiers were unlikely to fight nearly to the level of Germans, owing to being comprised of a mongroloid mix of races. Not only this, he felt that it would take several years for the US to adequately ramp up their armaments once they were directed at Germany instead of Japan, at which point the war in Europe would be over. What he apparently was unaware of was that for some time, Roosevelt and co. had already long been preparing for war on the armament side, and on top of that, in large part thanks to Hitler declaring war on the US, it would not be Japan the US would be too bothered about, with Roosevelt devoting a whopping 90% of US forces to supporting their British ally directly in Europe, with Japan something of an afterthought at first, despite it having been Japan who'd attacked the United States. On top of this, despite Japanese assertions to the contrary, Hitler apparently apparently was also under the impression that if Germany declared war on the US and supported Japan in this way, Japan would change its mind and aid Germany against the Soviets, something that not only didn't happen, but also Japan didn't even bother interfering with US source supplies being funneled through the port of Vladivostok on the Sea of Japan in support of Soviet efforts against Germany, something that rather pissed Hitler off, as you might expect, given Japan was right there and in a great position to cut off this vital supply line. We should also note of the supposed allies in Japan and Germany at this point of the war that both sides were exaggerating or outright lying to one another about their respective statuses in their two wars, with Hitler exclaiming in March of 1943, "They lie right to your face," and in the end all their depictions are calculated on something which turns out to be a deceit afterwards. Of course, the Germans weren't any better, and at the time of Japan's attack on the US, they seem to have generally been under the impression, based on German communiques, that Germany was very close to wrapping up the war in Europe and the conflict with the Soviets. Going back to Japan and their own blunder on all of this, perhaps not adequately understanding American culture and the classic modern-day "these colors don't run America, yeah" type attitudes. As noted, while they had hoped the attack at Pearl Harbor would drive US citizens to even more advocate for isolating and withdrawing from these conflicts so far away, in reality their attack had more or less completely gotten rid of the American apathy toward the wars happening in the world at the time, undoing the isolationism that the US had embraced post-World War I. On top of this, because of the attack, which was perceived publicly as unprovoked, even though the reality was Roosevelt and co. had been doing everything in their power to provoke Japan, the US populace now had zero interest in negotiating a treaty with Japan. The American people wanted those deaths and the supposed unprovoked attack avenged, and weren't going to stop until Japan was crushed. Not all the Japanese military leaders have been so deluded, however. For example, Marshal Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, in charge of the entire combined Japanese fleet, was not shy about his opposition to the original signing of the Tripartite Pact because of it not so subtly being directed at the United States. He stated that this on August 14, 1940, "To fight the United States is like fighting the whole world, but it has been decided. So I will fight the best I can. Doubtless I shall die on board Nagato. Meanwhile, Tokyo will be burnt to the ground 3 times. Kono and others will be torn to pieces by the revengeful people." He would also state after the fact, "Unlike the pre-tripartite days, great determination is required to make certain that we avoid the danger of going to war." He further stated, seemingly understanding his potential enemy in a way other leaders in Japan did not, should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, or even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. I wonder if our politicians, who speak so lightly of a Japanese-American war, have confidence as to the final outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices. Unfortunately for him, he wasn't listened to and was even in charge of the attack on Pearl Harbor that would bring about the result that he feared. And if you're wondering here, he was not killed aboard his flagship as predicted, but rather when the US intercepted an encrypted transmission outlining Yamamoto's plans to tour around the South Pacific inspecting his forces, and they were thus able to shoot down his plane. Perhaps not so bad a death for a man who stated, "To die for the emperor and nation is the highest hope of a military man. After a brave, hard fight, the blossoms are scattered on the fighting field. One man's life or death is a matter of no importance. All that matters is the empire." As Confucius says, "They may crush cinnabar, yet they do not take away its color. One may burn a fragrant herb, yet it will not destroy the scent. They may destroy my body, but they will not take away my will." In the end, thanks to Pearl Harbor, a drawn-out war with the US, something the Japanese military brass had known they'd lose quite handily if it happened, is exactly what happened. And while nobody in Japan could have anticipated the end result of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the overall outcome was inevitable from the start, given the US had no interest in a treaty. Making the move even more mind-boggling, as Japanese commanders had noted of the attack on Pearl Harbor in the first place, it would only be a mild delaying measure, and given the shallow waters they knew well, it was likely that the ship sunk there would be relatively quickly repaired and put back into service, which is exactly what happened with 6 of the 8 ships that found themselves on the bottom of the sea after the attack being repaired. In short, not a great plan, though at least was more defensible given the known information at the time and the needs of Japan than, say, Hitler's decision to bring the United States into the war on the European side. But in the end, going back to Japan and Germany's supposed alliance and why they both entered into it, while they did technically have an alliance on paper, it was exceptionally loose. And in practice, they were two nations fighting two separate wars at the same time. Both nations, however, were intent on attempting to mimic the imperial expansion of certain Western nations to become one of the have nations instead of have-nots. Most importantly, allowing their nations to have direct access to resources they otherwise depended on other nations for. And for a little while at least, the appearance of an alliance between them for various reasons benefited both. So they publicly allied, even if they never actually did much to support one another in any practical way, nor otherwise ideologically aligned much, with, again, the Japanese very explicitly choosing to deny requests from their German allies to join in the Holocaust. Of course, as mentioned, the Japanese committed their own series of atrocities during the war in the so-called Asian Holocaust, which is rarely discussed today, despite 3 to 30 million people being massacred in the regions Japan was, in their view, liberating. But that's a story for another day. Bonus fact. If you're wondering why only 2 days for Yugoslavia to have joined in the Tripartite Pact, it's insanely complicated, but in an overly simplified nutshell, the government at the time was in a rather tricky situation with no real ability to fend off the Germans and the British very explicitly offering no help. But funnily enough, the British more or less demanded that the country go to war with Germany anyway. After a whole lot of negotiating, the Yugoslavian leaders felt the Germans were offering the better deal, as they weren't really asking for anything other than Yugoslavia to publicly join up, but otherwise not requiring any military aid from Yugoslavia, but even accepting Yugoslavia's terms to not allow any military transport or presence of Axis powers in the country. Unfortunately for the leaders of the country, while this all may have made sense from a practical standpoint to preserve the country's sovereignty and more or less keep them out of the war, from an ideological standpoint, the people were rather upset with the decision, and so revolted, with the British doing their best to encourage all this. And almost immediately, with the help of the British, the people overthrew their governments with such slogans as "better the grave than a slave, better a war than the pact." Funnily enough, almost immediately after this and the new government's rejection of the treaty, Hitler decided to grant the demands of that chance, within a week going to war with the country, and within 3 weeks conquering it, putting many in the grave and making the others slaves anyway. Among a truly mind-boggling number of atrocities the Nazis and their cohorts committed that, even closing in on a century later, still have us all collectively occasionally surprised by their extent, is a little-talked-about program that saw hundreds of thousands of children kidnapped and many thousands more bred by the Nazis for the sole purpose of expanding the so-called ideal Aryan race. While the methods for encouraging such reproduction were numerous, perhaps one of the oddest was the use of thousands of young volunteer women called to do their duty for their country by living in special facilities dedicated to human breeding. Here, now, is the little told sad story of the Lebensborn children. After World War I, let's just say conditions in Germany weren't exactly ideal for a variety of reasons. Most pertinent to the topic at hand, birth rates had plummeted some 43% in the decade following the war. Contributing factors included the simple fact that well over 2 million young German men, most of whom were otherwise in the ballpark of prime age for starting families, died as a result of the war to end all wars. Needless to say, this was a problem, especially when combined with the mass and very extreme social stigma surrounding having a child out of wedlock. On this note, it was estimated by the German brass that around this time approximately 800,000 abortions were being performed within the country every year. While most of those weren't too much of a concern for them, about 100,000 of those abortions were done on women carrying what the Nazis considered biologically valuable racial stock, children they wanted to see born regardless of their parents' marital status. To attempt to begin to solve this baby-making issue, Hitler and his cronies strongly encouraged women of the country fit a certain profile to get hitched and get busy letting their men shampoo the Wookiee until the woman attached to said Wookiee contained a Nazi fetal parasite. To encourage this, on August the 12th, 1938, Hitler instituted the Mutterrenkreuz, which we're pretty sure, as ever, along with the Dutch, is just the Germans all poking fun at us by randomly mashing their fingers on a keyboard and then claiming to the non-German speaking world that said combination of letters is actually a word. In this case, apparently it means Mother's Cross of Honor. We're on to you, German speakers out there. But in any event, the point of this award was to encourage married German women of proper background to get busy between the sheets and pop out babies like some sort of human MG3 machine gun. Towards this end, there were 3 well-known classes of awards: bronze, silver, and gold. There are also references to a 4th level here that included diamonds placed on the swastika of the medal, but what the qualifications to get this one are isn't known. There is one woman who received it who had managed to give birth to an astounding 16 babies, so we're guessing it has something to do with that. As for the gold, this was for women who had at least 7 children. Women who gave birth to 6 got a silver, and a bronze went to women who had 5 babies. As for the other general requirements, both parents had to be German and otherwise deemed of good Aryan stock. The mother had to be deemed worthy of the award via exemplifying various traits that they deemed made a good mother and woman. And finally, all the babies had to survive being born. Beyond the medal itself, recipients of it were also given various privileges and honours, in some ways very much akin to honouring the country's soldiers. For example, any member of the Hitler Youth Organization was trained to salute any recipient of the Mother's Cross. On top of this, one account from the book Youth Glossary National Socialism Terminology from the Era of Dictatorship 1933 to 1945 notes, they were always given the best of everything: housing, food, clothing, and schooling for their children. Old people even had to give up their seats on the bus or streetcar. They were treated like royalty with the greatest respect. No standing in line for them. At the butcher's shop, the best cuts of meat would go into their baskets. Noteworthy here is that a recipient of the award could also lose it later if they were found to have neglected their children in some way, cheated on their husbands, or otherwise stopped exhibiting the traits of the then ideal of a mid-20th century German woman and mother. But this was just one piece of a multifaceted plan to increase birth rates within the country among those that the Nazis wanted breeding. Enter head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, who, besides being one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, in his spare time came up with the idea of encouraging young women to be used as breeding stock for his SS soldiers, then take the babies from them and give them to good Aryan homes. He also thought it would be just a smashing idea to kidnap other people's babies, with the ones deemed racially valuable sent to good German homes and the rest murdered or experimented on. Brutally, because apparently Himmler has just got a Himmler. As to the breeding side and why he chose SS members, Himmler had cultivated people in the SS who, in his view, were only of ideal Aryan stock. He stated of this, like a nursery gardener trying to reproduce a good old strain which has been adulterated and debased, we started from the principle of plant selection and then proceeded quite unashamedly to weed out the men whom we did not think we could use for the build-up of the SS. Ironically, the man at the top, Himmler, did not actually meet his own qualifications here, but, we digress. Towards this end, in 1931, he even required any SS wishing to marry and start a family to produce documents proving their family tree going all the way back to 1800, with every member on that tree needing to be of Aryan descent. If they could not produce proof of this, they were given the boot from the SS. Those and their prospective spouses who fit the bill were then encouraged to have a minimum of 4 children. But in any event, after such vetting, Himmler had his stock of their view of the ideal man. Now, he just needed the women and babies, and enter the picture Lebensborn e.V., essentially Fount of Life Association, which was founded on the 12th of December, 1935. Outlining what the organization was all about, on September the 13th, 1936, Himmler penned the following to his SS concerning the Lebensborn and its goal: to support racially, biologically, and hereditary valuable families with many children, placement and care of racially, biologically, and hereditary valuable pregnant women who, after thorough examination of their and their progenitors' families by the Race and Settlement Central Bureau of the SS, can be expected to produce equally valuable children. Care for the children, care for the children's mothers. He also noted, it is the honourable duty of all leaders of the Central Bureau to become members of the organisation Lebensborn e.V. As a perk of all this, wives of the SS could use the Lebensborn for its birthing facilities and other such pregnancy aid, but it was also open to any women who were pregnant, whether out of wedlock or not, so long as they were of good racial stock and their baby would likewise be. As previously alluded to, this was seen as a way to put a stop to the common practice of aborting babies born out of wedlock, at least so long as they were of the proper racial backgrounds. On this note, approximately 60% of the women who took advantage of the Lebensborn were unmarried. But all of that wasn't producing the birth rates the brass desired, so they decided to become a little more proactive in two ways. First, to attempt to begin recruiting young women willing to breed with members of the SS more or less anonymously, and later also to kidnap children of conquered lands who fit what they were looking for. We'll get to the mass child kidnappings and murder, as well as Kinder KZ, the concentration camp for children, in a bit, but for now, let's talk specifically about the breeding program. Enter Hildegard Trutz to tell us about it from her personal experience. Trutz was a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi supporter and a product of the Bund Deutsche Madel, band of German maidens. She states, much like many of her countrymen, "I was mad about Adolf Hitler and are now better Germany." It's noteworthy here that Trutz was also a picture of the blonde-hair, blue-eyed Aryan ideal. She also states, "I was pointed out as the perfect example of the Nordic woman, for besides my long legs and my long trunk, I had the broad hips and pelvis built for childbearing." And so it was that in 1936, freshly out of school and ready to face the world, Trutz didn't really know what to do with herself. It was at this point her Bund Deutsche Madel leader suggested, why not give the Führer a child? What Germany needs more than anything is racially valuable stock. The Lebensborn program was then outlined to her, and that once her background was thoroughly vetted, she could be used as a breeding partner for SS officers. And that during the program, her needs would be taken care of and should otherwise be contributing to her country in a significant way. She later stated of this, "It sounded wonderful." So as not to concern her parents, she told them she would be going to take a course in National Socialism and be living at the facility. That facility, as it turns out, was located in a castle in Bavaria where she resided with a few dozen other girls who had likewise been thoroughly vetted. As for this process, she states it was mostly just showing proof of Aryan ancestry through to your great-grandparents on both sides of your family. She also stated the whole place was in the charge of a professor, a high-up SS doctor who examined each of us very thoroughly as soon as we arrived. We had to make a statutory declaration that there had never been any cases of hereditary diseases, dipsomania, or imbecility in our family. Also noteworthy here is that the girls were made to sign an agreement that any children they had during their time in the program would be property of the state and sent to institutions to be taught Nazi ideology before being given to suitable families. The girls were kept in relative luxury, with facilities for basically anything they wanted, even a movie theatre. Trutz stated of this, "The food was the best I've ever tasted. We didn't have to work, and there were masses of servants." As to the men they were made to socialize with, she states, "They were all very tall and strong with blue eyes and blonde hair. We were given about a week to pick the man we liked, and we were told to see to it that his hair and eyes corresponded exactly to ours. When we had made our choice, we had to wait until the 10th day after the beginning of the last period." Noteworthy here is that neither side was to ever know the real names of each other for total anonymity. Also noteworthy is that SS officers involved were not just single men, but a mix of married and not, chosen for their supposed ideal attributes to be the male half of breeding stock for the nation and race. Once the assigned 10th day after the woman's period came, they were examined medically and then told to invite the future father of their child to their room for some spicy time. She states of that, "As both the father of my child and I believed completely in the importance of what we were doing, we had no shame or inhibitions of any kind." She also noted her boy toy was incredibly attractive, but seemed remarkably dumb. But nevertheless, for 3 nights running, they got it on, and he also got it on with other girls in the castle who chose him as well, intermixed in there at the same time. And so it was that Trutz soon found herself knocked up. Once it was confirmed that she was pregnant, she was taken to a maternity home to bake her baby. As for the actual birthing, she states, "It was not an easy birth, for no good German woman would think of having any artificial aid, such as injections to deaden the pain, like they had in the degenerate Western democracies." She was then allowed to keep her baby for 2 whole weeks before he was taken away and she never saw him again. Apparently not at all traumatized by this, after she considered signing up for another go, but soon met an officer in the real world and married him instead. She states of telling him what she had done for her country that she was rather surprised to find that he was not as pleased about it as he might have been. Nevertheless, he did acknowledge that she had been doing her duty, so he let it go. Unfortunately for her baby, and the approximately 8,000 to 20,000 others produced in this way, by the way, about 30 million short of the overall program's original one-generation goal, she never found out what happened to him. If, like pretty much all other known Lebensborn children, after the war his life was probably not super awesome, as we'll get into shortly. In any event, while all of this seems morally questionable enough, at the least it appears for the most part that the adults involved were all there of their own volition. While maybe not ideal for some, and certainly not for the babies produced, the adults at least don't appear to have been forced into anything in most cases. Caveats like that plenty of SS men and the like did have babies with foreign women in conquered lands, which sometimes were considered of good enough stock and in some cases also taken, which brings us to another facet of the Lebensborn program. As mentioned, as the breeding facilities just weren't churning out enough babies, it was deemed advisable to simply kidnap children from lands that the Germans had conquered who seemed to fit the bill of good Aryan stock. A similar, I would say to this, obviously in such a mixture of peoples, there will always be some racially good types. Therefore, I think that it is our duty to take their children with us, to remove them from their environments if necessary by robbing or stealing them. Either we win over any good blood that we can use for ourselves and give it a place in our people, or we destroy that blood. He also noted of the whole thing, they should raise the children in proper educational facilities or in German family care. The children must not be older than 8 or 10 years, because only till this age we can truly change their national identification, that is, final Germanization. The condition for this is complete separation from any relatives. Children will be given German names, their ancestry will be led by a special office. While these children could come from just about anywhere, Poland, as happened in many aspects of the war at the hands of the Nazis and later the Soviets, got the short end of the stick, with an astounding estimate of upwards of 200,000 children being taken from there, eclipsing that of anywhere else. These kids were put en masse on trains to various locations for processing, with it noted that providing sustenance to the children wasn't exactly a high priority, and thousands died before arriving at their destination. Besides sometimes being sent to more remembered places today, like Auschwitz, there was also a camp called Kinder KZ, a concentration camp built for children, specifically Polish children, where they were variously made to work as child laborers, some as young as just 2 years old, and others experimented on or otherwise murdered. As for the exact processing of the children taken, those who seemed like they might be of good stock were sent to the Kindererziehungslager, or children's education camps, where a process of quality selection was utilized to examine not just the children's apparent racial backgrounds, but also the children being subjected to various medical and psychological exams, and then assigned an overall score for their desirability, with even little things like the shape of their skull or the presence of and size of birthmarks considered. They were then ultimately divided into 3 groups: desired, acceptable, and undesired. From here, depending on their score, they were then sent off to anywhere from an SS family to a boarding school or orphanage to a concentration camp. As for the biologically valuable children, they were subsequently indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, given a new German name, and made to learn and speak German, with harsh penalties if they ever failed or resisted too much in any of this, even to the point of them being shipped off to a concentration camp if they didn't toe the line. For the lucky ones, it also appears the story given to the children about why they were now living with a new family was simply that the parents had died. As for those undesirables, an account from Auschwitz on a few hundred of their fate notes that they were given lethal phenol injections and that they did not wait until the doomed really died. During his agony, he was taken from both sides under the armpits and thrown into a pile of corpses in another room, and the next victim took his place on the stool. Going back to the aftermath of the war and what happened to the Lebensborn children, as the war was winding down and the Nazi defeat was imminent, records of where many of these children came from, and indeed just general information about the program itself, were largely destroyed before the Allies could get their hands on them. This, unfortunately, meant that many of the hundreds of thousands of children who were kidnapped or the product of the state breeding program had no real way to be reconnected with their families, with only about 10% ultimately doing so. On top of that, even for those who could be reunited, this was often yet another traumatic thing in their young lives, as many had spent several years with their new families and sometimes had little, if any, memory of their former lives and parents or relatives, thus ripped from their homes yet again against their wills. That said, some did have somewhat happy endings, such as one Gisela Heidenreich, whose mother was a secretary for the Lebensborn program and had an affair with an SS officer while there, ultimately giving birth within the program, but allowed to keep her daughter. While Gisela endured people calling her an SS bastard after the war, she was eventually able to reunite with her father, and for her part compartmentalized who he was and what he had done, simply stating, "When I first met him, it was on a station platform. I ran into his arms, and all I thought was, I've got a father." As previously alluded to, just as bad were the children of the breeding programs, particularly in places like Norway and Germany itself, were largely shunned, and they and their parents stigmatized, with reports of the women variously being occasionally beaten, having their hair shaved off forcibly, and otherwise communities doing everything possible to run them out of town. Beyond this program, really any child of a German soldier to a foreign mother during their respective occupations were painted in the same negative light. In Norway, where there were an estimated 12,000 such children born, with some of the children placed in mental mental institutions after the war, along with attempts to forcibly ship them off to other countries. Being bullied and abused also seems to have been the order of the day, much like often happened to their mothers. Some escaped this oppression by leaving Norway, perhaps most famously a little girl by the name of Anifrid Lindstad. Her mother, Sinni Lindstad, was just 19 when she had a child with a German sergeant, Aldred Haas. At the close of the war, Haas fled home to Germany, and the teen Sinni was seen as a collaborator for having had a child with a German soldier. To escape their treatment in Norway, Anifrid's grandmother, Arntine, took her to Sweden, with Sinni joining them not long after, though dying of kidney failure at the tender age of just 21. Fast forward just under 2 decades later, and that little girl grew up to be one of the lead singers of the band ABBA. After World War II, the German state was utterly destroyed. It was split in 4 parts, and to top it all, coming face to face with the scale of the atrocities their government and armies committed through public events like the Nuremberg trials. This, in combination with the process of denazification, which can be seen as a large-scale rehabilitation program, and the regaining of independence, albeit as 2 states, helped the German people in the 50s to begin looking towards the future, burying the past. It was not just a lost war, which people can accept while still feeling proud about their deeds during it, as perhaps the French used to view Napoleon's efforts, which ended in defeat, or Austria's defeats in the 7 Years' War. Rather, in this case, the sensation after the war seems to have been similar to a person regaining their senses after having committed acts of violence under the influence, akin to a crowd cheering for a football team or other such instances of mob mentality which all humans are susceptible. Naturally, given all the revelations after the war and the atrocities committed, the Germans collectively wanted nothing more than to forget and focus on new goals. First the economy, which led to the German economic miracle, and then on the foundation of the European Union, of which in the coming decades it would arguably become the leading country. But what about the history books in school? After all, typical after any conflict, whether a given side is the winner or the loser, the history taught in schools tends to be coloured to favour one's own people. This, however, could not happen in Germany. The reasons for this were varied, from making sure something like that couldn't happen again, and of course the scale of the atrocities on a global level and the small time gap that separates us from those events and how well documented those events are. This brings us to the broad strokes of how this particular conflict was and is taught in German schools. We should point out here that in Germany the education system is regulated not by the federal government but independently in each of the 16 states that constitute the German Federal Republic, or BRD. So the way history is taught, although generally falling within the same lines, can vary a lot from region to region. For example, the choice of literature used in the various classes differs greatly, not only from year to year but also from federal state to federal state. That caveat out of the way, the study of the war period and how this is viewed in German schools can be generally divided into 4 parts. The first, the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic, at least its beginnings, are generally viewed positively. It is seen as a first decent effort towards democratization, despite the problems that it faced in the aftermath of World War I. The various problems culminating in the economic crisis of the late 20s and the subsequent rise of the Nazi regime are dealt with in detail, emphasizing the mistakes that would lead to the fall of the democratic system. One would say that the Weimar Republic, despite the brevity of its existence, is viewed with a certain nostalgic sentiment, accompanied by the looming threat of what was to come. And that is not just the war, but the Nazis themselves and their ideology. Nazi ideology and atrocities. Head-on, the students are confronted with the crushing effects of totalitarian regimes, radical ideologies, and where these can lead. In addition to photo and video documentaries, most schools organize mandatory school trips to Holocaust memorials, usually former concentration camps. This does not only apply to history class. Students are also introduced to the works of literature tackling the issue of Nazism and ethnic hate in Europe at the time. This can include, but is not limited to, authors such as Bertolt Brecht and Thomas Mann. Additionally, Jewish voices are amplified in terms of Jewish poetry, reports from survivors, and historical documentaries focusing on the long-term consequences of hate and violence. Some of the literature choices indicate that the schools try to emphasize the aspects of humanity and also the problem of group mentality and prejudice, as seen in works such as the post-war play Andorra by Max Frisch and more recent works such as The Boy in the Striped Pajamas from 2006 by John Boyne and The Reader by Bernhard Schlink. They also look at the diaries of Anne Frank. Excerpts excerpts of pro-Nazi texts are also studied once the students are deemed mature enough to handle this. In this vein, excerpts from Mein Kampf are tackled in advanced history class, stressing the contradictions within the text, what contemporary citizens might have identified with, and the lack of morality therein. Interestingly, as if to complement Nazi ideology with a similar type of prejudice, the other major topic focused on intensely is that of slavery, racism, and segregation in America. The war itself. Remarkably, the details of the fields of war are often underplayed in German schools. A possible reason for this is that showing maps of expanding German territory during the first 2 years of the war and discussing their winning battles might cause encouragement of nationalistic pride, which seems counterproductive to many given the points that educators are trying to teach. Furthermore, the discussion of the details of each battle that Rommel won or lost in Africa, or the supply problems on the Eastern Front, are not vital to the analysis of the atrocities of the Nazi regime. Another more practical aspect is that already much time has been allocated to the subject of war anyway, so they cut down on the actual battles. Of course, one downside of de-emphasizing this is many German students are never really made aware of many specific military events and conquests, since most emphasis in school is put on the internal developments, theoretical or philosophical aspects, and of course on the ideology and practice of ethnic cleansing and the ruthlessness to other groups of people seen as ethnic, cultural, or political outcasts, such as Jews, homosexuals, communists, etc. The result is that the military developments of war are understated, as alluded to. The result is that, shockingly, many German students are actually surprised to learn things like that Germans invaded places like modern Ukraine, modern Serbia, and Greece. In contrast to these broader war strokes, resistance against the Nazi regime within Germany is heralded as an example of heroism and bravery, one such example being the siblings Sophie and Hans Scholl, members of the resistance group the White Rose. Such examples allow German students to find figures from the wartime with whom they can identify with. On this note, not every regular German who lived in the 1930s and 40s is painted as a terrible person. After all, when dealing with such a large group, as in any populace, there are plenty of good people and a percentage of bad. That said, given all that happened, a large emphasis is put on even most of the good people being complicit in the atrocities by looking away and not doing anything to stop it. Defeat in post-war. The major destructions in Germany and the high cost of human lives during the war is not attributed to the Allies, but rather to the Nazi regime itself, which is being viewed as the perpetrator in starting an unnecessary war in the first place. Furthermore, most of the destruction on German soil was inflicted in the last year of the war. The obstinacy of not surrendering, even as it was clear that the outcome of the war would be negative, is seen as proof of the minimal care the Nazis expressed toward their own people. The suicide of members of the party, such as Himmler and Hitler himself, is seen as an act of cowardice on their part. Thus, rather unique in history, the opposing forces who were victorious are not generally seen in a negative light by those they defeated. Far from it. On that note, the occupation of the German cities by the Allied army is characterized as liberation. This is despite, of course, the fact that the Allied soldiers at the time didn't seemingly view the race to Berlin as a race to free Berlin. The choice of words, however, comes with the emphasis that by losing the war, the German people were freed from Nazism. An interesting example comes from alternative history broadcasts that contemplate a world after supposed German victory. These paint a horrific dystopia in which the Germans, as well as the occupied people, would be suppressed by a ruthless Nazi regime. The 8th of May is therefore known as the Day of Liberation. Making parallels to the way the European Renaissance supposedly liberated the medieval people, the liberation as well as the denazification process led to an internal catharsis among Germans concerning Nazism. Reflecting all of this in popular German cinema, German war films, especially in the last few decades, tend to deal with the subject with honesty, showing the gradual shift to madness caused by hollow mass delusions, often in a tone more fatalistic than heroic. Therefore, they can be much deeper than a typical war movie, and if you're up for that, you might enjoy work such as the Generation War miniseries. There's also the movie The Fall, perhaps mostly known thanks to the most meme-ified Hitler scene ever. Of course, one major issue of all this in the way it's taught in schools and extreme emphasis placed on this period of history is the subject of imposed collective responsibility on modern Germans, even if just implied or felt, rather than ever explicitly stated. stated. At first glance, it is good to study these events in great detail to make sure they don't happen again. However, an issue for Germans, of course, is the sense of collective responsibility, despite no student today or their parents or even potentially their grandparents having anything to do with any of that. How much weight does the idea of original sin have? How is a person born in the 2000s responsible for the Nazi atrocities? It is still heavily frowned upon to display the modern-day German flag, despite officially and explicitly not being a Nazi symbol. On a similar note, a nationalistic display such as pledging allegiance to the flag during class every morning would have the worst possible connotations in Germany, despite being common in places like the United States. Furthermore, there is a high percentage of population with immigrant heritage. Just look at the German national football team. As you might expect from all of this, there is some concern that the German school systems may go too far with the seeming obsession with the Nazis and all the mistakes that they were making, instead of spending more time on broader history, as is more typical in other nations. Whatever one's opinion on that, as an interesting little side note, the German denazification process was considered such a success that decades later Americans sought to apply a same methodology after occupying Iraq. Unsurprisingly, that was not exactly successful.
Running into battle armed with a broadsword, bow, and a quiver of arrows was perfectly acceptable if you were fighting in the 100 Years' War or fending off some orcs on Middle-earth. But when it comes to World War II, such medieval weaponry looks like child's play next to the technology of the time. A sword isn't the most likely of defenses against rifles and tanks. However, for John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, nicknamed Mad Jack, there was nothing he'd rather arm himself with than a trusty sword and bow. Born into an Oxfordshire family, he graduated from the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst in 1926. Before his World War II fame, Mad Jack worked as an editor of a Nairobi newspaper, a model, and a movie extra, appearing in The Thief of Baghdad due to his expertise with a bow. That same talent with archery took him to Oslo, Norway, where he shot for Britain during the World Championships in 1939. By this time, of course, Europe was fast approaching World War II. Mad Jack had left the army after 10 years of service, but happily returned to it because of the country having gotten into a jam in my absence. By 1940, Mad Jack was the second in command of an infantry company. He always marched into battle with a bow and arrows and his trusty basket-hilted claymore by his side. Despite these weapons being wildly outdated, Churchill defended them, saying, "In my opinion, any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." His medieval weaponry wasn't just for decoration either. During the 1940 Battle of Dunkirk, in which 300,000 troops became stranded on the beaches and had to be evacuated, Churchill struck down a German soldier with a well-placed arrow. He was later seen chugging along on a motorcycle with his bow strapped to the side. A German officer's cap was hanging on the headlight. In 1941, Mad Jack volunteered for Operation Archery, an attack on a German garrison in Norway, in which he led 2 companies during the battle. There's no word on whether he was able to use his bow in the aptly named operation. In the battle, he and his companies were in charge of taking out the German batteries on Malloy Islands. On the vessel bringing him to shore, Churchill stood at the front playing his bagpipes to the tune of The March of the Cameron Men. When they landed, he charged ahead of the rest of his men with his sword in hand. His sword also served him well later, in 1943. At the time, Mad Jack was a commanding officer in Salerno when him and his troops were forced into the line of fighting, something for which they hadn't been trained. Churchill went ahead of his soldiers, wielding his sword. He leapt out at German sentries from the darkness, blade held high, and the Germans were so frightened by the demon that they surrendered. Churchill took 42 prisoners that night with the help of just one other companion and his trusty sword. This was in line with his philosophy on fighting the Germans, which he described after capturing the 42. "I maintain that as long as you tell a German loudly and clearly what to do, if you are senior to him, he will cry, 'Jawohl,' yes sir, and get on with it enthusiastically and efficiently, whatever the situation." Next, Churchill was sent off to Yugoslavia, where he led a series of raids against the Germans from the island of Vis. In May 1944, a bigger operation was planned involving 3 attacks on separate hilltop positions. Mad Jack led one group up the hill, but only 6 of them managed to reach the target. Jack found himself in open view of the enemy with only a few able-bodied men to defend him, so he did what any sensible soldier would have done: he played his bagpipes. This time he played "Will Ye No Come Back Again," and this was until he was knocked unconscious by German grenades and captured. Churchill was placed in Sachsenhausen concentration camp after being interrogated. The Germans had believed that he was some sort of relative of Winston Churchill, which wasn't the case, but he was still considered a prominent prisoner due to his rank. As you might expect, Mad Jack wasn't one to be kept in a prison camp. He made a run for it in September by sneaking through an old drain under the barbed wire. He and a comrade were recaptured not long after it and moved to a camp in Austria. In April 1945, the Austrian camp's lighting system failed. Churchill took advantage of the opportunity and melted into the darkness, walking away from his work detail. He simply kept walking, and 8 days and 150 miles later, he ran into the armored vehicles of the United States Army in Italy. He managed to convince them that he was a British colonel despite his scruffy appearance, and he was returned to safety. Safety wasn't exactly something Mad Jack was after, though. He was disappointed to learn that the war was winding down and that he had missed a year of it. Rather than return home, he got himself assigned to Burma, where the war against Japan was still in full swing. By the time he got over there, though, the bombs had been dropped on Japan, meaning that the war was basically over. An unhappy Churchill vented, "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we would have kept the war going another 10 years. The end of the war didn't mean the end of Churchill's adventures, though. He decided to train as a parachutist, and when he was qualified, he was sent to Palestine as the second-in-command of the 1st Battalion. He later became a land-air warfare instructor in Australia, where he developed a love of surfing. He ended up retiring from the army in 1959 and died in 1966 in Surrey. And now for a bonus fact. Not just eccentric in war, Mad Jack was known for throwing his briefcase out of the train window. His reasoning? Well, he was throwing it into his backyard, which the train happened to go past. This way, he didn't have to lug it home with him from the train station.
On January the 23rd, 1943, at the Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army captured a Luftwaffe lieutenant, one Leo Rabal. That name did not ring any particular bell amongst the Soviet interrogators, just another POW. Except he wasn't. Lieutenant Rabal himself revealed to his captors the identity of his infamous uncle, Adolf Hitler. Now, Hitler could hardly be described as a family man, and despite persistent rumours, there has never been any hard evidence that he fathered any children. And yet, no person exists in a vacuum, and Hitler had several siblings and other close family members. So, who were these individuals, and what did they get up to during and then after World War II? Now let's begin by introducing our main characters with a brief rundown of Hitler's family tree. As noted in our video, What Was Adolf Hitler Like as a Child?, Adolf's father, Alois, married 3 times and had countless affairs and mistresses along the way, siring a number of known children with several women, and probably had some unknown children on top of that. As for the more well-documented offspring, in 1873, at the age of 36, Alois married his first wife, 50-year-old Anna Glassel. The union was for career advancement reasons, and ultimately childless and unhappy, in part owing to Alois's unabashed philandering. The two separated but didn't divorce in 1880, and Anna died on April 6, 1883. Now free of his marriage, the following month, Alois married his longtime mistress, 21-year-old Franziska Matzelberger. Alois and Franziska already had a child out of wedlock, Alois Jr., born on January 13, 1882, and when they married, Franziska was already pregnant with a second child, Angela, born on July 28, 1883. As an interesting little aside here, the very following day, the 29th of July, a blacksmith and a teacher in northern Italy welcomed their first child, whom they named Benito Mussolini. In any event, Franziska, despite her young age, became ill with a lung disorder and died on August 10, 1884. Alois was now free to marry his latest pregnant mistress, who had already taken over care of his children when his wife got sick, Clara Polzel. Well, not so fast. You see, Clara was either Alois's niece or first cousin once removed. Importantly, as far as the Catholic Church was concerned, it was the latter, thanks to a birth certificate change that Alois had done when he was 39, with some family members corroborating who he claimed his real father was, as his mother had not owned up to it when she gave birth to him. Either way, such a marriage in Catholic Austria-Hungary required a dispensation from the Pope, which was granted at the end of 1884, allowing for the two to exchange vows in January of 1885. Alois and Clara ultimately had 5 children. 3 of them died in infancy between 1885 and 1887, and then came Adolf, born April 20th, 1889, Edmund in March 1894, and Paula in January 1896. Edmund died of measles in June 1900 because the past was the worst, leaving the Hitler household with 4 children: Alois Jr., Angela, Adolf, and Paula. The future dictator and Paula both died without offspring, although, again, much speculation has been made about Adolf's alleged illegitimate children. For example, according to one story, he may have sired a child with British socialite Unity Mitford, sister to celebrated novelist Nancy Mitford. We'll save Hitler's alleged children for a topic another day, though. In any event, Alois Jr., a rather colourful character, as we'll discuss shortly, married twice. His first marriage was with an Irish woman, Bridget Dowling, in June 1910. They had one son, William Patrick, born on March the 12th, 1911, who arguably has the most interesting story of all the close relations. Alois Jr. later remarried, this time to a woman named Hedwig Heidemann in 1916, welcoming another boy, Heinrich or Heinz, born on March the 14th, 1920. Angela Hitler, sister to Alois Jr. and half-sister to Adolf, perpetuated what appeared to be a family tradition and also married multiple times. In September 1903, she tied the knot with Leo Rabal, and the couple welcomes 3 children: Leo Jr. in October 1906, Angela Maria, known as Gili, in June 1908, and Elfriede in January 1910. In August of that year, Leo Sr. died unexpectedly, and Angela waited 26 years before remarrying with Martin Hammerschich. The two would not have any more children. Thus, to recap, when World War II started, Adolf Hitler had 7 living, extremely close relatives: Sister Paula, half-siblings Alois Jr. and Angela, half-nephews William Patrick, Leo and Heinz, and half-niece Elfriede. Noteworthy, Elfriede's sister Gili, who Hitler was allegedly in love with, had committed suicide under mysterious circumstances in 1931 during her quasi-imprisonment in Hitler's home. We'll get to that later. For the moment, let's take a look at those relatives who took an active role in World War II. Following Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland in September of 1939 and the outbreak of World War II, Hitler's half-nephews were all of the right age to serve in the military, and serve they did, although not on the same side. Heinz Hitler. Let's start with our younger character, Heinrich Heinz Hitler. Heinz was unquestionably a strong supporter of Nazi ideology. His uncle Adolf kept most of his family at arm's length during his years in power and during the war, not willing to dish out favours out of nepotism. The dictator, however, had a soft spot for Heinz and helped him enroll at the National Political Institute of Education, an elite school for future leaders of the party and the SS. Afterwards, however, Heinz was left to his own devices. The ambitious youngster entered the Heer, or Land Army, as a junior signals officer in the 23rd Potsdam Artillery Regiment. In June of 1941, Heinz joined Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and distinguished himself in action, earning himself an Iron Cross Second Class. By January the 10th, 1942, the Soviet Red Army had launched a counter-offensive around Moscow, rolling back the Axis invaders. Heinz was ordered to collect some radio equipment from an army post before it was overrun by the Soviets, but the young officer arrived too late. Captured by the enemy, Heinz was transferred to the Butrika military prison in Moscow. Surely, the Red Army could not believe their luck when they had seized such a prized prisoner, and yet Soviet captors could not extract much leverage, as the unlucky Heinz died on February the 21st of unclear causes, possibly as a consequence of mistreatment or even torture. Leo Rabal Jr. It appears that the younger generation of Hitler clan had little luck when it came to fighting the Soviets, as a similar fate befell Heinz's cousin Leo Rabal Jr. After graduating from university, Leo Jr. made a living teaching chemistry in Salzburg, Austria. During this period, he made sporadic visits to his mum Angela, who was running Uncle Adolf's household in the Berchtesgaden residence. Again, it appears that Adolf quite liked his half-nephew, but did not seek to favour him in any way. Shortly before the war, Leo had become a manager at the steelworks in Linz, also in Austria. But in October 1939, he was drafted into Luftwaffe as a lieutenant in the engineering corps. In 1941, he too joined Barbarossa and was detailed to Friedrich Paulus's doomed Sixth Army. This was the force that fruitlessly tried to capture Stalingrad, suffering enormous losses. Leo was not immune to the carnage and suffered an injury in January 1943. Paulus suggested that Lieutenant Rabal be airlifted back home to safety, but Hitler refused, stating that an officer should stay with his men until the end. And that end came on January the 23rd, 1943, when the Red Army captured Rabal and took him to Moscow for interrogation. The relation with the Führer was not evident at first, and it was Leo who actually revealed it to his captors, proceeding to disclose useful intelligence about Hitler's relatives and especially about his inner circle, information which would prove very valuable after the war when the Soviets seized some of the top Nazi leaders. For the time being, Rabal had a glimmer of hope to return home when Uncle Adolf proposed a prisoner exchange. If the Red Army released Leo, the Nazis would release Yakov Dujagvili, Stalin's own son, taken as a POW back in July 1941, but the Soviet dictator refused categorically, stating that war is war. Ultimately, the refusal to make a swap cost Yakov his life, dying in the camp on April 14, 1943 at the age of 36, though how isn't exactly clear. As for Leo Jr., he remained in captivity until 1949 when he was subjected to trial for war crimes. He was found guilty of supporting the Nazi war of aggression and being involved in the crimes of the Sixth Army, and was sentenced to spend 25 years in a Gulag labor camp. Luckily for him, in 1955, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer petitioned for the release of German POWs. The new Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed, and thousands of servicemen returned home in September, including Rabel. Leo Jr. resettled in Linz, where he resumed his work as a teacher. He died of tuberculosis in the summer of 1977, survived by a son born back in 1931. Now, Leo's son is part of the last generation of Hitler relatives who are alive to this day. Their names and general whereabouts are publicly available if you search for them, but we'd rather not disclose them here. As you can imagine, these individuals have attracted plenty of attention as representatives of the Hitler bloodline. However, they have always stated that they have no sympathy for their great-uncle's ideology, no interest in politics, and simply want to get on with their lives, and we want to respect their wishes. William Patrick Hitler. Moving on from there, we have the rather interesting case of William Patrick Hitler, who served in the US Navy during World War II. You might be wondering, well, how the hell did that happen? So let's dive into that story. It was the winter of 1910. At a horse show in Dublin, Ireland, Bridget Elizabeth Dowling met a young, strapping Austrian waiter named Alois Hitler Jr. The two entered a passionate courtship despite the disapproval of Bridget's father, William. The lovebirds eloped to London, where they married on June 3, 1910, infuriating Mr. Dowling. The father of the bride even tried to have Alois Jr. arrested for kidnapping, but somehow he came to accept his son-in-law by 1911. On March 12th of that year, Bridget gave birth to a boy, William Patrick Hitler. 2 years later, however, the toddler found himself fatherless as Alois Jr. dumped Bridget and relocated to Germany. As mentioned earlier, he would remarry in 1916, siring Heinz. This second marriage made him a bigamist, by the way, as he had never legally separated from Bridget. As per Bridget and William Patrick, they went through a rather long rough patch as Mum took on several odd jobs in Liverpool trying to make ends meet. The boy was educated as an accountant, first in Liverpool, then in Middlesex, and by 1927 he was hired by catering equipment company Bennon & Son in London. In 1928, William Patrick resumed contact with his father, and in 1929 visited him in Germany. On this occasion, Alois Jr. took William to Nuremberg, where the two attended a congress of the Nazi Party, not yet in power but very much on the rise. This is when William first saw his half-uncle Adolf, but the two met in person only in 1930. The relationship between the two was cordial at first, and William returned to London with an autographed photo of the future Führer. In 1931, William visited Germany again, on the occasion of his cousin Gilia Rabal's alleged suicide using Adolf Hitler's gun and in his home, which we'll get to shortly. After that visit, William sought to capitalize on his family name, releasing a series of articles in England covering Hitler, the Nazis, and Germany in an unflattering light. This enraged Uncle Adolf, who summoned William back to Berlin and gave him a piece of his mind, demanding for the articles to be retracted. William could not catch a break. He was persona non grata with his powerful uncle, sure, but also soon found himself blacklisted back in England in March of 1932, losing his job due to his relation to his uncle. Strapped for cash, William appealed to his dad to try and sweet-talk Uncle Adolf into securing him a job in Germany. Towards this end, he travelled once more to Berlin, hoping to reconcile with Hitler. However, all he got from dear old uncle was a letter disavowing any familial connection and refusing any future monetary assistance. Alois Jr. doubled down, making it clear that his loyalties were with his half-brother rather than his son. Thus, William made his way back to London for a time before making another trip to Berlin in October of 1933. By then, Uncle Adolf had become the Chancellor and undisputed Führer of the Third German Reich. William first approached Ernst Röhm, leader of the brown-shirted SA, who then interceded with Hitler himself. Surprisingly, the dictator had a change of heart. He gifted his half-nephew with 500 Reichsmarks and even asked his deputy Führer, Rudolf Hess, to help William find employment. William was first hired by a Berlin bank and then became a car salesman with Opel Automotive. By 1936, however, he had again fallen out of favour, owing to allegedly name-dropping his uncle to help secure car sales. As is a theme, Hitler never appreciated any of his family trying to ride his coattails, and this all resulted in the Führer in a fury, leading to William's work permit being revoked. Now, if your future job depended on the mood of a murderous dictator, who also had allegedly killed his niece who he was allegedly in love with, well, what would you do? Well, probably not what William did, resorting to blackmail. After the war, during the Nuremberg trials, Nazi official Hans Frank revealed how William had written to Hitler, threatening to expose his complicated and unusual family history. In other words, confirming the rumors that Hitler's biological grandfather was a Jewish merchant named Leopold Frankenberger. Now, I'll get to whether there could be any truth to this in the bonus facts section later. But for now, both Adolf and Alois Jr. went ballistic, and William wisely fled Germany, returning to England and breaking for good with that side of his family. Back in London, he tried his hand at journalism, most notably publishing the article Why I Hate My Uncle, and later tried to enlist in the British Armed Forces. This attempt was unsuccessful. After this latest debacle, both him and Mum Bridget boarded the SS Normandy in February 1939 and relocated to the US as the young Hitler had received an invitation from a newspaper magnate, William Randolph Hearst, to perform a series of lectures in America about the Nazi Party and life in Germany. Fast forward to March of 1942, when FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was forwarded a letter for his analysis of William by none other than President Roosevelt. The letter, written by William, read in part, "I am the nephew and only descendant of the ill-famed Chancellor and leader of Germany, who today so despotically seeks to enslave the free and Christian peoples of the globe. Everybody in the world today must answer to himself which cause they will serve. To free people of deep religious feeling, there can be but one answer and one choice that will sustain them always and to the bitter end. I am one of many, but I can render service to this great cause, and I have a life to give that it may, with the help of all, triumph in the end. All my relatives and friends soon will be marching for freedom and decency under the stars and stripes. For this reason, Mr. President, I am respectfully submitting the petition to you to inquire as to whether I may be allowed to join them in their struggle against tyranny and oppression. I have attempted to join the British forces, but the British are an insular people, and while they are kind and courteous, it is my impression, rightly or wrongly, that they could not in the long run feel overly cordial or sympathetic towards an individual bearing the name that I do. More than anything else, I would like to see active combat as soon as possible, and thereby be accepted by my friends and comrades as one of them in this great struggle for liberty." And that's right, Hitler's half-nephew was asking directly for Roosevelt's permission to join the fight against the Axis. Ultimately, Hoover looked into William's background and cleared him for service. Thus, on March 6, 1944, William was sworn into the US Navy as a hospital corpsman and was dispatched to the Pacific Theater. Not much is known about his service record, except that he received a shrapnel wound in his leg and was ultimately discharged after being awarded a Purple Heart. By then, the full extent of the genocidal atrocities perpetrated by his infamous uncle had been proven definitively, and let's just say, regardless of the fact that he'd fought for the US during the war, having the last name Hitler was not exactly ideal. Thus, William finally decided to change his surname to Stuart Houston. In 1947, he married his German-born fiancée, Phyllis Jean-Jacques, and the two settled in the state of New York. From then on, the Stuart Houstons would lead a quiet and uneventful life. They established a medical analysis lab, Brookhaven Laboratories, which they apparently ran out of their home. Beyond this, the couple also had 4 children, 3 of whom are seemingly still alive to this day, but none of them have their own children. This is often stated to have been a part of a pact to terminate the Hitler bloodline. However, there is no corroboration of said pact, and all evidence is it probably is just an urban legend, including at least one of these sons explicitly stating that it is false. For example, noting one of them was engaged and planned to have children before his untimely death at the age of 32 in a car accident. Further, another one of the brothers was apparently briefly engaged before he and his fiancée had a falling out over his heritage, Alois Jr. So that covers the dictator's nephews who took an active role in the war, but that doesn't conclude our trip up and down Hitler's family tree. I mentioned earlier how Adolf's half-brother Alois Jr. had quite the backstory. Well, as children and teens, Alois Jr. and Adolf never really got along. Adolf was always his mum Clara's favourite, who, at least at first, helped shield him from the ire and extreme abuse of dad Alois. As a consequence, at least at this stage, Alois Jr. often bore the brunt of their father's many beatings without such protection. This would, as we've noted in our What Was Hitler Like as a Child video, change once Alois left and Adolf became the eldest male child and most primed for the constant abuse, regardless of his mother's efforts to protect him. But in any event, the young Alois was never given a high-level education and was sent to learn a trade as an apprentice instead. But it appears that the boy had a rebellious streak, and rather than pursuing an honest career, he took to stealing and was sentenced for theft on 2 occasions in 1900 and 1902. Finally, in 1905, he decided to emigrate to England, where he would later marry Bridget Dowling. Earlier, I mentioned how their son, William Patrick, was born in 1911 and how Alois Jr. left England in 1913. What I did not mention was that in between those 2 dates, much like his father before him, Alois Jr. often took to the bottle, subjecting both his wife and son to frequent beatings. As mentioned, he remarried with Hedwig and fathered Heinz, where he would remain stuck after the start of World War I. As mentioned, he remarried with Hedwig and fathered Heinz, but on account of the whole already being married thing, he had to stand charges of bigamy in 1924. This charge carried a sentence of 6 months in prison, but it appears it was revoked or suspended. At the end of 1927, Alois Jr. joined the NSDAP and seemingly maintained some contact with his half-brother Adolf, and definitely throughout the 1930s during William Patrick's visits to Germany. Alois did not hold any government nor party office after his ambitious relative rose to power, but he did enjoy some perks. In 1933, he opened a small restaurant in Berlin called Café Alois, which, thanks to his familial connection, was always replete with high-ranking patrons, including Nazi officials and ministers, often giving them access to private rooms to conduct delicate business. Moreover, Alois took advantage of a racial law to evict his Jewish neighbors and take over their properties, thus expanding his premises at very little cost. Ultimately, in 1937, Alois was able to buy a much larger restaurant in a prestigious location within the German capital. Business was thriving, and in no small measure thanks to his blood ties to the Führer. And it appears that during the war, Alois continued to run his restaurant without incidents of note. However, as the Red Army approached Berlin in April 1945, the restaurateur decided it was closing time and promptly relocated to Hamburg. Paper trail has him re-emerging in October of 1945 after the war had ended, when a resident named Alois Hitler sent a letter to the Drebahn police department asking for his surname to be changed to Hiller. In his letter, Alois admitted to being the half-brother of the former Führer, but claimed to have no affiliation to the Nazi Party whatsoever. The Hamburg police believed him and allowed for the name change. However, in 1947, just like any other German, Herr Hiller was subjected to a denazification procedure initiated by the Allied occupation authorities to purge the country of the vestiges of the old regime. It was at this time that the local police received a testimony from one Walter Herzog, who had known Hillier since the late 1930s. Thanks to Herzog, authorities found that Alois had indeed been a member of the party, had favored meetings of Nazi officials, and had unjustly profited from racial laws. The ensuing investigation even dug up letters sent by Alois to Reich authorities, which had caused the deportation of 3 individuals to a concentration camp. Occupation authorities, therefore, filed Alois Hiller as a Category 3 former Nazi. This category indicated lesser offenders to be placed on probation for 2 or 3 years, but not to be interned. By the end of 1949, Alois was exonerated of all charges. This coincided with a general period of leniency towards most lesser offenders, as German society wanted to move on. Thus, Alois Jr. Hitler, now officially known as Herr Alois Hiller, lived peacefully his last years, dying on May 20th, 1954 in Hamburg. Paula. Even though Alois was subjected to the denazification process, he escaped the scrutiny of the Allied occupation forces. The same can't be said for Adolf's sister Paula, who was interviewed by the US Army Counterintelligence Corps CIC in July 1945. During her interrogation, Paula recounted how the two were never particularly close during childhood, as she was 6 years younger than Adolf, stating, "He never considered me a playmate." After their mother Clara's death in 1907, Adolf left home, and Paula knew nothing about his whereabouts and activities until 1921. In that year, Adolf resurfaced in Vienna, where Paula was living at the time, and she barely recognized him. The older brother, however, apparently was very charming and affectionate with Paula, and she states, "What made the biggest impression on me was the fact that he went shopping with me. Every woman loves to shop." In the following years, the two had little contact, interacting mainly by correspondence. For example, in one instance, Paula would write a letter to Adolf on his birthday, and he would reply with a care package of Spanish ham, flour, and sugar. In the late 1920s, Paula found employment in a Viennese insurance company, but her brother's notoriety attracted the attention of her employers, and in 1930 she was fired. From then on, Paula would receive a monthly allowance of 250 marks from Adolf. The siblings did meet in person once a year from 1929 to 1941. On one such occasion, in the summer of 1936, the now Führer instructed Paula to change her surname to Wolf. As Paula stated to the CIC, "This was to maintain the strictest incognito. That was sufficient for me. From then on, I kept this name. I added the Mrs., as I thought that was less conspicuous." During World War II, the now renamed Mrs. Wolf maintained a low profile, working as a typist in a hospital with Hitler's blessing. But during this time, Paula met and fell in love with a medical officer with the SS, Erwin Jeklius, involved in the infamous Action T4, the Nazi euthanasia program. Paula informed Adolf of their intention to marry, and this time he did not give his blessing. The Führer feared that this prospective brother-in-law may lay a claim on future succession, and thus botched the wedding by transferring Jeklius to the Eastern Front. Eventually, he was captured by the Red Army and died in a gulag in 1952. As noted, at the end of the war, Paula was interrogated and later released by the CIC. In her statements, she denied knowledge of the atrocities perpetrated by her brother's regime and even felt that Hitler himself hadn't known of them, as well as expressing admiration for her brother and sorrow for his eventual downfall, despite their at times fractured relationship. In her own words, "The personal fate of my brother affected me very much. He was still my brother, no matter what happened. His end brought unspeakable sorrow to me as his sister." After being released from US custody, Paula moved back to Vienna and then to Berchtesgaden in 1952, where she would be closely taken care of by former SS officers. In 1959, she agreed to be interviewed by Peter Morley, a British reporter working for ITV. In her interaction with Morley, Paula reiterated her admiration for her older brother and once again stated that she did not believe that he could have done anything as horrible as people said. This would be Paula's first and last public interview. She died the following year, on June 1st, at the age of 64. Angela, Gili, and Elfried. During her interrogation at the hands of US intelligence services, Paula also had some kind words for her half-sister Angela. To quote her, "I especially remember Angela as a beautiful girl. It seems like young Angela was surrounded by wooers, all of whom were thoroughly vetted by her father Alois." Quoting again, "He was examining every wooer with the strict demands that only a civil servant was allowed to marry her." Well, Dad must have been very happy then when Angela married Revenue Officer Leo Rabol in 1903. As mentioned earlier, the union was short-lived as Leo died in 1910. Following his death, Angela and her 3 children moved to Vienna, where she would work as a cook for the Mensa Academica Judica Association of Jewish Students. Interestingly on this one, according to the famed 1943 OSS report, a psychological analysis of Adolf Hitler, his life and legend, written by psychoanalyst Walter C. Langer while working at the boarding house, quote, "Some of our informants knew her during this time and report that in the student riots, Angela defended the Jewish students from attack and on several occasions beat the Aryan students away from the steps of the dining hall with a club." Much like in the case of Paula, Adolf and Angela Hitler had little contact during the years of World War I and in the early 1920s. Then in 1925, Adolf hired Angela to run his household in Munich. She accepted the offer and relocated to the Bavarian city, bringing along her 17-year-old daughter, Gili. From their very first meeting, the future dictator was immediately obsessed with the younger girl, becoming possessive and controlling. Some of Hitler's then political opponents described the relationship as scandalous and sexual in nature, although whether there's any truth to this, it's not totally clear. It appears, however, that Uncle Adolf was infatuated with Gili, and the girl partially reciprocated this affection. In 1927, Hitler asked Angela to relocate to Berchtesgaden on the Bavarian Alps to manage his larger private residence, the Berghof Villa. But Gili was to remain with him in his Munich apartment. It is not clear if Gili accepted of her own volition or was forced to accept by the domineering Adolf. What is known is that for the ensuing 4 years, uncle and half-niece would live together in Munich. In December of 1927, Hitler's chauffeur, Emil Maurice, confessed to his boss that he was having a relationship with Gili. The furious future Führer forced an end to the love story and removed Maurice from his post. From then on, Hitler would strictly regulate Gili's activities, dictating who and who she could not associate with, and preventing her from applying to a music school in Vienna, as well as any time she wished to go anywhere and he decided to let her, having her chaperoned by one of his men. Despite the extreme restrictions, according to her mother Angela, by 1931, Gili had somehow initiated another relationship, this time with a man from Linz. But Hitler also put an abrupt end to that romance. This all leads us to September the 18th, 1931, when Hitler and Gili had a furious argument, during which Adolf forbade her once again from going to Vienna. Hitler then left town, heading to Nuremberg for a party meeting. But the next day, he was hastily recalled to Munich. Gili had been found dead in their apartment, lying in a bedroom in a pool of blood. The cause of death? A gunshot wound to the chest, apparently fired from Hitler's own pistol, which was lying next to Gili. So, was the wound self-inflicted? Well, that mystery's never been solved, as no inquest, let alone an autopsy, was ever performed. Rumours began to circulate that Gili had suffered a broken nose in addition to the gunshot to the chest, and that she may have been pregnant. But again, with no post-mortem, these remained just uncorroborated rumours, and noteworthy here is that most of them seem to have been started by Hitler's political enemies. That said, for whatever it's worth, William Stewart Houston stated, "When I visited Berlin in 1931, the family was in trouble. Everyone knew that Hitler and she had long been intimate and that she had been expecting a child, a fact that enraged Hitler." Thus, it's been suggested that in a rage, Hitler killed her. Whatever the case here, What has been confirmed by members of Hitler's inner circle, such as Rudolf Hess and Hermann Goering, is that Geely's death sent Adolf Hitler into a deep depression, and afterwards he was allegedly more extreme in his ideology. The dictator's official photographer Heinrich Hoffmann went so far as to comment that the moment of Geely's death was when the seeds of inhumanity began to grow inside Hitler. Geely's death must have impacted Angela as well. Nonetheless, she continued working for Adolf at the Berghof residence until September 1935 when she moved to Dresden. Then in February 1936, she married for a second time with architect Martin Hammerschich. The two continued living in Dresden throughout the war until the spring of 1945. As the Red Army encroached, Hitler and Angela relocated to Berchtesgaden while her husband remained behind and eventually committed suicide in May. Noteworthy, in his will, Hitler left Angela 1,000 Reichsmarks per month as a pension, though it's not clear if she ever got this. Shortly before his death, however, he did give her and Paula around 100,000 Reichsmarks, presumably knowing his own demise was nearing and wanting to ensure that they were somewhat taken care of. In the summer of 1945, just like Paula Hitler, Angela was interviewed by the USCIC. The report compiled by her interrogators was titled "The Very Uninteresting Life of Hitler's Half-Sister." Allied intelligence services had indeed very little interest in Angela, who was quickly released. Hitler's half-sister, former housekeeper, and alleged mother of his lover died of a stroke on October 20th, 1949. And this all brings us to the last of Hitler's immediate family, Elfriede Maria, daughter to Angela. And to be honest, there's not much we know about her life. We know that she was born on January 10th, 1910 in Linz, Austria, and that she had married one Ernst Hogegger in June of 1936 in Dusseldorf. Elfriede apparently lived a quiet and uneventful life until she passed away on September 24th, 1993. Her son, born in 1945, is alive at the time of writing, though likewise little is known of him. And similar to the other remaining still living descendants, we aren't inclined to dig too deep here to try and find him. Bonus fact. As previously alluded to, one popular hypothesis on the interwebs is that Hitler's grandfather was a Jewish man by the name of Leopold Frankenberger. However, most historians dismiss this, as there is quite literally not a shred of evidence to support the notion outside of the claim of one Hans Frank, who, for a time, was the Governor-General of occupied Poland, where he was overseeing the mass murder of over 4 million people during his time in office there. Shortly before his execution for these crimes, Frank would claim Hitler had asked him to quietly investigate Hitler's lineage to try and track down who his biological grandfather was. Frank says he did so and claims Hitler's grandmother was working for a Jewish man named Leopold Frankenberger at the time she got pregnant with his father, and, curiously, that she had received money from him for some 14 years after Alois was born, with it conjectured that he paid her during this time lest she reveal he'd knocked her up. Thus, if it were true, it would make Hitler's grandfather a Jew. Naturally, unlike internet commenters, historians since have dug deeper on this one and haven't been able to find record of anything of the sort, not even of any Frankenberger living anywhere near there during that period, let alone evidence of such a mythical man being Jewish. Not only that, Jews have been expelled from the region for a few centuries up to that point, only permitted to return a few decades after Alois was born, making it even more unlikely that, regardless of name, she was impregnated by a Jewish man. On top of that, several parts of the story have been proven to be incorrect. History books often remember underground political groups like the Communist Party or the Social Democrats, espionage groups like the Red Orchestra, or militaries from America and Britain as the primary resistance against Nazi forces. But you may be surprised to learn that, in fact, the most vocal and visible resistance came from young people, mainly teens and those in their early 20s, with the four largest and most prominent of these youths being the White Rose, the Edelweiss Pirates, the Swing Youth, and the Zazaus. So let's dive into their respective rather inspiring stories, shall we? To begin with, the White Rose. We will not be silent. We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace. These are just a few of the powerful words published and distributed throughout Germany by a group of students at the University of Munich in an effort to incite their fellow countrymen to rebel against Nazi forces throughout 1942 and 1943. As for notable figures in this group, perhaps the most famous of all were siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl. So what inspired them to rebel in this way? In the 1930s, Hans and Sophie were both teenagers living in Germany, and despite their parents trying to dissuade them, feeling a sense of pride and patriotism in their homeland, Hans joined the Hitler Youth at the age of 15 in 1933, and Sophie joined the Bund Deutscher Madel, the League of German Girls, at the age of 12. At the time, Adolf Hitler was pounding the favorite drum of seemingly all politicians making the country great again, and the Scholl children, like so many others, believed him. However, their parents, Robert and Magdalena Scholl, were far less enthusiastic, believing that the Nazi Party would lead Germany to ruin, something that Robert wasn't exactly shy about, stating of Hitler, "He's expanding the armaments industry and building barracks. Do you know where that's all going to end?" A pacifist who saw the writing on the wall, he further stated after the establishment of the first concentration camp in 1933, "This is war. War in the midst of peace and within our own people. War against the defenseless individual. War against human happiness and the freedom of its children. It is a frightful crime." Nevertheless, all his speeches were ignored by his 6 children, with Elizabeth Scholl, who, by the way, only died 3 years ago in 2020 at the age of 100, later stating, "We just dismissed it. He's too old for this stuff. He doesn't understand. My father had a pacifist conviction, and he champions that. That certainly played a role in our education, but we were all excited in Hitler Youth in Ulm, sometimes even with the Nazi leadership." Ingersoll would go, "There was something else that drew us with mysterious power and swept us along. The closed ranks of marching youth with banners waving, eyes fixed straight ahead, keeping time to drumbeat and song. Was not this sense of fellowship overpowering? It is not surprising that all of us, Hans and Sophie and the others, joined the Hitler Youth. We entered into it with body and soul, and we could not understand why our father did not approve, why he was not happy and proud. On the contrary, he was quite displeased with us." Nevertheless, he allowed his children to do as they wished. As noted by Richard Hanser, author of A Noble Treason, the story of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Revolt against Hitler, quote, "They could say whatever they wished, and they all had opinions. This was far from customary practice in German households, where by long tradition the authority of the father was seldom questioned or his statements challenged. His aversion to mindless nationalism was not only unchanged, but stronger than before. In his dinner-table discussions with his children, he could interpret events for them with an insight unblurred by current prejudices or official pronouncements." A friend of the family, Susan Herzl, goes on, "Sophie's relationship with Robert Scholl held a depth of mutual understanding. It continued to exist despite the pain she caused her father by joining the League of German Girls. She could observe his distress when he watched party displays on the cathedral square outside their Ulm window, or when he argued with Hans. Her father had not tried to prevent her from joining. He knew that opponents to tyranny could never be created by force, only by personal experience." And experience is exactly what they got over the coming years, slowly becoming disillusioned with the Nazi Party as they observed their activities and what they were being taught in the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. As you might imagine, the children of a man who believed strongly in the freedom to express your opinions and do as you believed in didn't exactly mesh with totalitarianism and unconditional subordination under Nazi rule, nor did family opinion of the Nazis improve when the teenage Hans was briefly arrested in 1937. On this one, a few years previous, at the age of 16, Hans had had a homosexual encounter with 2 individuals by the names of Ernest Redden and Rolf Huttenecht, the latter of which revealed his relationship to the authorities. Hans was also accused of being a member of the non-sanctioned youth organization, the Deutsche Jugendschaft. However, the judge in the case ultimately released him, stating Hans's sexual dalliance with another boy was simply, to quote, "a youthful failing," and that the rest was just an example of youthful exuberance. He also noted Hans's otherwise exemplary conduct as a member of the Hitler Youth, even rising to squad leader, and that was sufficient to let him off and give him a clean slate. So fast forward to August of 1942, and Robert, like his son before him, likewise found himself arrested, in this case for telling his secretary, "The war, it is already lost. This Hitler is God's scourge on mankind, and if the war doesn't end soon, the Russians will be sitting in Berlin." As for his secretary, who turned him in for this, she would state that she had nothing against Robert. "I liked him. I had to suppress my personal feelings. I was fond of Herr Scholl, and I was grateful to him. But when he said those things about the Fuhrer and the war, I knew I couldn't let it pass." As for Robert's children, at this point Sophie was attending Munich's Ludwig Maximilians University studying biology and philosophy, though during this particular summer was required to work at a metallurgical plant as part of compulsory work via the Reich Labour Service. This was her second stint in this, with her previous time working as a nursery teacher in the Auxiliary War Service. As for Hans, he was also studying at the same university, and likewise in this particular summer of their father's arrest was required to do his duty for Hitler, in his case serving his second stint on the front, formerly in France, and in this one as part of Operation Barbarossa. Serving beside him at the time were 2 of his medical student friends, Alexander Schmorell and Willy Graf. Previous to this service time, and shortly before the arrest of Hans's father, Alexander and Hans and a few others in their circle had started to publish their political opinions, albeit anonymously, in the hopes of encouraging others to resist the Third Reich, with the small group writing the first 4 leaflets criticizing the regime in June and July of 1942. These were subsequently distributed in various ways, from leaving them in random places to even mailing them to countless people across Germany, including being sent to be distributed at other universities. They briefly paused such activities while deployed, but upon their return to school in October, doubled down and the group expanded considerably. As for the contents of the group's leaflets, the first essay published by the White Rose noted rather prophetically, "Who among us has any conception of the dimensions of shame that will befall us and our children when one day the veil has fallen from our eyes and the most horrible of crimes, crimes that infinitely outdistance every human measure, reach the light of day?" Going further with leaflet 2, they wrote, Hitler himself wrote in an early edition of his book, a book that is written in the most awful German I have ever read, despite which the nation of poets and thinkers have elevated to the status of the Bible. You would not believe how one must deceive a nation in order to rule it. If this cancerous growth in the German nation was not too noticeable in the early phases, then that is because there were enough forces for good at work to try and slow its growth. But as it grew larger and larger and finally ascended to power by means of one last vulgar corruption, the abscesses erupted and defiled the whole body. Now it is a question of mutually coming to our senses and mutually keeping one another informed. We must always keep these things in mind and allow ourselves no rest until the last man is convinced of the utmost necessity of his battle against this system. Since Poland was conquered, 300,000 Jews have been murdered in that country in the most bestial manner imaginable. In this, we see a terrible crime against the dignity of mankind, a crime that cannot be compared with any other in the history of mankind. Jews are human beings too. It makes no difference what your opinion is regarding the Jewish question. These crimes are being committed against human beings. Each man wishes to be acquitted of his complicity. Everyone does so, then lies back down to sleep with a calm, clear conscience. But he may not acquit himself. Everyone is guilty, guilty, guilty. Not mincing words with their opinion of Hitler, by leaflet 4 they wrote, Every word that proceeds from Hitler's mouth is a lie. When he says peace, he means war. And when he names the name of the Almighty in a most blasphemous manner, he means the almighty evil one, that fallen angel Satan. His mouth is the stinking maw of hell, and his might is fundamentally reprobate. There is no punishment on earth that is adequate for the deeds of Hitler and his followers. Out of love for the generations to come, we must make an example of them after the conclusion of the war so that no one will ever have the slightest desire to attempt something similar. The fifth leaflet, Appeal to All Germans, came after the corps members returned from the front during Operation Barbarossa, at which point they became convinced Germany was shortly going to fall. Nearly 10,000 copies of this leaflet were distributed in January of 1943 throughout Germany, urging Germans to rise up and create a new state based on protecting individuals' rights. They wrote, With mathematical certainty, Hitler is leading the German nation to disaster. Hitler cannot win the war. He can only prolong it. His guilt and the guilt of his assistants have infinitely exceeded all measure. The just punishment grows ever closer. Germans, do you and your children wish to suffer the same fate as the Jews? Do you wish to be measured with the same measure as your seducers? Shall we forever be the most hated and rejected nation in all the world? No. Therefore, separate yourselves from the National Socialist subhumanity. Prove with your deeds that you think differently. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the protection of the individual citizen from the caprice of criminal violent states. These are the bases of the new Europe. And this brings us to the sixth and final leaflet, distributed on February the 18th, 1943, a little over 2 weeks after the German defeat at Stalingrad. It was then that the White Rose movement became emboldened in the hopes that the crushing defeat on the Eastern Front would inspire the mostly silent opponents of the Nazis within Germany to rise up. Their target audience on this one was their fellow students. And so it was that on February the 18th, the two Scholl siblings took a suitcase full of copies of the sixth leaflet, this one written by Professor Kurt Huber, who had joined the group a couple of months before in December, and brought it to their university, leaving stacks of the leaflets around for students to find. The leaflet in part stated, The day of reckoning has come, the reckoning of German youth with the most abominable tyrant our people have ever been forced to endure. We grew up in a state in which all free expression of opinion is ruthlessly suppressed. The Hitler Youth, the SA, the SS have tried to drug us, to regiment us in the most promising years of our lives. For us, there is but one slogan, fight against the party. The name of Germany is dishonored for all time if German youth does not finally rise. Take revenge. Smash its tormentors. After leaving stacks of the document around, Sophie decided to toss the remaining pamphlets off a railing and into the central hall. Unfortunately, this action was spotted by a janitor and maintenance man and Nazi Party member, Jacob Schmidt. He thus quickly reported the students to the Gestapo and they were promptly arrested. Initially, things didn't seem so bad. However, Sophie had managed to get rid of any incriminating evidence before being caught, and it was seemingly just Schmidt's word against theirs. However, Hans had not managed the same, and upon being searched, he was found in possession of a draft of a seventh leaflet written by fellow White Rose member Christoph Probst. In a last-ditch effort to destroy the evidence against Probst and himself, Hans tore the document and then attempted to eat it, but enough remained when they managed to stop him that the Gestapo was able to later match the handwriting to Probst after they discovered another letter from Probst in Hans's lodgings. While being interrogated, however, Hans attempted to play off Probst's participation by stating, with regards to political matters, I exercised influence on Probst. Without my influence, he undoubtedly would never have reached these conclusions. I've withheld this acknowledgement for so long because Probst's wife is currently confined to bed with puerperal fever following the birth of their third child. I must say that I commissioned Props to put his thoughts into writing a while ago. The last time we met, in the beginning of January 1943, he gave me the piece of paper that I tore up today. I must expressly note that I said nothing to Probst about using his written notes for producing leaflets. I similarly assumed that Probst was absolutely in the dark about the actions I had undertaken. The Gestapo weren't buying it, however, and on February the 20th, when Probst went in to pick up his paycheck before intending to go and see his wife Herta and their new daughter Katya, he was arrested. This was something his young wife was not initially informed of by the nurses, as she was extremely ill after giving birth to the couple's third child, and the nurses didn't want to upset her while in that state. As for Sophie, Hans's efforts to put all the blame on himself almost succeeded there, with the lead interrogator, Robert Moore, initially convinced that she was innocent. That is, until Sophie decided to do the same as her brother and try and protect other members of the group by putting the responsibility for the leaflets on herself and admitting her actions freely. Despite her trial, Sophie also spoke directly to Chief Justice Roland Freisler, saying, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare to express themselves as we did." For his part, Justice Freisler, who, by the way, had the fun nickname of the Hanging Judge owing to his propensity to sentence the vast majority of people brought into his courtroom at the time to death, stated during the trial that he didn't understand how good kids who had once been members of the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, along with Probst once serving in the Luftwaffe, could have had their minds twisted so severely. And as for the Scholl parents, Robert and Magdalena, they were banned from the courtroom, but that didn't stop them from trying to force their way in anyway, with a guard barring them, stating, "You should have brought them up better." That said, Robert did manage to get into the courtroom after begging the defense attorney, "Go to the president of the court and tell him that the father is here and he wants to defend his children." Ultimately, he was allowed to briefly speak to the judge, who promptly had him thrown out after. As he was dragged out, he reportedly shouted, "There is higher justice. They will go down in history." And so it was that on February the 22nd, 1943, Hans and Sophie Scholl, along with Christoph Probst, were sentenced to death, with the ruling in part stating, "We find that the accused have, in time of war, by means of leaflets, called for the sabotage of the war effort and armaments, and for the overthrow of the National Socialist way of life of our people, have propagated defeatist ideas, and have most vulgarly defamed the Führer, thereby giving aid to the enemy of the Reich and weakening the armed security of the nation. On this account, they are to be punished by death. Their honour and rights as citizens are forfeited for all time." Despite executions normally being preceded by a 99-day buffer between sentencing and execution, in these three's case, the sentences were ordered to be carried out that very same day, presumably to make sure no outside political unrest could build up if anyone were to call for their release. On top of this, initially the executions were to be public hangings, but there was concern this could make the three political martyrs, and further again have the potential to incite unrest. Thus, the executions were carried out in relative secret, with even the media being mostly mum about the specifics on this one, just noting that the trio were degenerates and things of this nature. Surprisingly for all involved, when the Scholl parents asked to be able to speak with their children before their executions, the request was granted around an hour before. As for Hans, he told them, "I have no hatred. I have put everything behind me." Sophie was brought in to see them next, and when her mother broke down and lamented, "I'll never see you come through the door again," she responded, "Oh mother, after all, it's only a few years more life I'll miss." Within an hour of this, Hans and Sophie Scholl and Christoph Probst were beheaded by guillotine at the Munich Stadelheim prison. First Sophie, then Hans, and finally Christoph. Sophie and Christoph reportedly said nothing as the guillotine was dropped, but Hans shouted, "Es lebe die Freiheit! Long live freedom." As for Sophie's last known words, her cellmate, Elsa Gabel, claims that the last thing Sophie said to her was, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give herself up individually to a righteous cause? It is such a splendid sunny day, and I have to go. But how many have to die on the battlefield in these days? How many young, promising lives? What does my death matter if by our acts thousands are warned and alerted? Among the student body, there will certainly be a revolt." Unfortunately, though we now recognize these individuals as exceptionally brave, heroic rebels in the fight against the Nazis, the public reaction at the time of their deaths was far from what Sophie had anticipated. As soon as the siblings were executed, classmates at the university rallied at the school to condemn the White Rose's actions, and Hans, Sophie, and all of their cohorts were considered traitors to the fatherland. The man who had turned them in, Schmidt, was subsequently given a reward of 3,000 Reichsmarks and a promotion. On top of that, a special ceremony was even organised in his honour at the university, with masses of students giving him a standing ovation at the end. And as a brief aside to cleanse our palate a bit over the sequence of injustices, after the war, Schmidt was promptly himself arrested and given a 5-year prison sentence in a labour camp, with his part in the deaths of the Scholls and Probst helping giving him the official label of major offender and the labour camp sentence. In any event, 2 months later, on April the 19th, 1943, Alexander Schmorl, Willy Graf, Professor Kurt Huber, and 10 other White Rose members were also sentenced to death, and another 13 members were given prison sentences. Ultimately, some members of their families were arrested too in the Nazi practice of assuming guilt by relation, also known as Sippenhaft. This included Robert Scholl, who was arrested 5 days after his children were killed and given an 18-month prison sentence, allegedly for listening to illegal radio broadcasts. In any event, in his defense plea, Professor Huber said that the White Rose endorsed fighting for the right to political self-determination. Noteworthy in Alexander's case, his family managed to not only petition for clemency, but received a response from Hitler himself, who wrote to them simply, "I reject all petitions for mercy." Alexander, who would ultimately be canonized as a saint by the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, for his part accepted his fate well, writing to his family, "I am going with the awareness that I followed my deepest convictions and the truth. This allows me to meet my hour of death with a conscience at peace. Think of the millions of young men who have lost their lives out in the field. Their fate is the same as mine. In a few hours, I will be in a better life with my mother, and I will not forget you. I will ask God to grant you solace and peace." He would also say to his lawyer, "I'm convinced that my life has to end now, early as it may seem, for I have fulfilled my life's mission. I wouldn't know what else I have to do on this earth." All that said, the harsh punishments dealt to these students backfired in a way, which is a slight silver lining. Word of the trials, executions, and imprisonment of these students made its way to Norway and Sweden in March of 1943, and reports began to spread throughout Scandinavia and Great Britain. The leaflets and successive reports on them became an important resource in foreign reporting, including the sixth and final leaflet being smuggled out of the country by German lawyer Helmuth James Grad von Moltke. Between July the 3rd and July the 25th, Britain's Royal Air Force even dropped several million copies of the sixth leaflet over Berlin, Dortmund, Dusseldorf, Köln, Munster, and Weimar. Further, on August 2nd, 1943, the International Student Assembly held a rally in New York in honor of the student resistance in Munich. Among the many notable speakers at the rally was United States First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Of course, while these students' efforts were not initially honored in their home nation, when the war was over, public opinion of the White Rose within Germany shifted drastically, with the first memorial held in Munich in their honor taking place in November of 1945, a mere 6 months after Germany surrendered. The students were commended for their attempts to awaken the German people from their lethargy, and today, all over Germany, streets, squares, schools, and public institutions are named for various members of the White Rose. The Scholl's father, Robert, also almost immediately became mayor of Ulm from 1945 to 1948 after being released from prison when Allied troops arrived in the region. The aforementioned author of A Noble Treason, Richard Hansa, summed up, "The Scholls and their friends represented the other Germany, the land of poets and thinkers, in contrast to the Germany that was reverting to barbarism and trying to take the world with it. Their actions made them enduring symbols of the struggle, universal and timeless, for the freedom of the human spirit, wherever and whenever it is threatened." Not all youth-led Nazi rebellions were so political, however. In fact, most weren't nearly as political as the White Rose, which brings us to our next group, the Edelweiss Pirates, initially composed of mostly 14 to 17-year-olds who were perhaps the most stereotypical rebellious teens to ever rebellious teen. By the end of the 1930s, when the Nazi Party was in full force, there were several gangs made up of former Hitler youth who now opposed the ideologies they had learned there. Regardless of what they called themselves or where they were from, many of these gangs fell under the umbrella of an unofficial group called the Edelweiss Pirates, so named for the Edelweiss flower badge many resistance members wore. In a time when gathering in groups and participating in extracurricular activities outside of the approved Hitler Youth activities was criminalized, the Edelweiss Pirates essentially said to hell with that and rebelled by doing whatever they wanted to do, including declaring an unofficial war on the Hitler Youth, attacking them at every opportunity. As one Nazi official stated, "Every child knows who the pirates are. They are everywhere. There are more of them than there are Hitler Youth. They beat up the patrols. They never take no for an answer." Not just beating up their fellow teens, because all of the work in Nazi Germany was in some way done in service to the Nazi Party, the Edelweiss Pirates refused to work. If they did turn up to their jobs, they didn't engage or make any effort to be productive. Therefore, these gangs garnered a reputation for being lazy, useless slackers and parasites, leeching off the government and giving nothing in return. They saw their friends and family go to war in order to defend the restrictive and oppressive rules laid forth by the Third Reich, and they wanted no part of it. One teenager and Edelweiss pirate said, "Everything the Hitler Youth preaches is a fraud. I know this for certain, because everything I had to say in the Hitler Youth myself was a fraud." Apart from their recognizable pins, the pirates also often had their hair long and wore colorful clothing. They played and sang songs by Jewish composers and watched broadcasted anti-Nazi messages. Groups of Edelweiss pirates gathered in cafes, parks, or out on the street. They took hikes and rode bikes to the country to go on illegal camping trips. They played pranks and performed acts of sabotage. They painted graffiti and passed around anti-Nazi propaganda. As time went on, these acts became bolder and far more serious, however, with some pirates raiding army camps to obtain firearms and explosives to use to attack Nazi officials. Some even derailed train cars full of ammunition in order to supply adult resistance groups with explosives. A pirate in France named Jean Julich noted how he and his friends threw bricks through munitions factory windows and poured sugar water into the gas tanks of Nazi vehicles. Some pirates also stole food and supplies from stores or freight trains. As you might expect, some of this did not go unpunished, though in many cases their extreme youth helped shield some of them from being executed at least. For example, the aforementioned Jean Julich was arrested at the age of 15 and subsequently imprisoned and tortured for 4 months. In contrast, on November 10, 1944, his slightly older friend, Barthol Schenk, whom he was arrested alongside, was publicly hanged in Cologne, France, accused of killing 5 people, though he was given no trial. The cause of Barthol Schenk's hanging was his membership in the Edelweiss Pirates, Julich explained, adding, "He planned to blow up a Gestapo building, but he never killed anyone. Of the 13 people hanged on that November day, Schenk was the youngest, put to death shortly before his 17th birthday." Moving on from the Edelweiss Pirates, the next group we'll focus on are the Swing Youth, or Swingjugend, a group comprised of mostly 14 to 21-year-olds. These were the young people across Germany and Europe who rebelled via another classic of youthful rebellion tactics, via their music and dance. Jazz music and dancing became popularized in the Roaring '20s and spread quickly throughout the Western world, Germany included. However, in Nazi Germany, broadcasting jazz music became banned. That said, despite swing music being a derivative of jazz, it was never entirely outlawed, so many could get away with listening to it and dancing to swing. However, if the swing music was known to come from a Jewish person, like the king of swing, Benny Goodman, a known Jew living in New York City, it was considered degenerate, and anyone caught listening to it could face severe consequences, with no doubt their elderly persecutors lamenting the noise that these kids called music these days. As you might imagine, though, swing music was nearly impossible to regulate completely, so swing and jazz alike continued to reach the teens and young people of Nazi Germany. In fact, one way some of the Swingjugend were able to discover new songs and dance moves was by going to the movie theater where anti-American propaganda reels were played. Here, German teens could watch Americans doing the Lindy Hop, a hugely popular dance at the time, helping them to stay up to date with the latest dance moves. One subgroup of the swing youth was the Hot Club of Frankfurt. This was a jazz band who basically just wanted to play their music. Its founders were 14-year-old Horst Lippmann and 21-year-old Hans Otto Jung, and they, along with a few of their friends, played jazz music in the back of Lippmann's parents' restaurant. Someone kept a lookout at all times, and if the Gestapo were nearby, the band would switch to music that was more Nazi acceptable. Hans Otto Jung later recalled, "Jazz meant more than just music to us during the war. The Nazis did not like jazz and wanted to suppress it. That made us love it even more." Although the Hot Club focused more on playing jazz music rather than swing, some of their members intersected with the swing youth, and their values were very similar. At their core, they, like the swing youth, celebrated non-Aryan culture and defied the rules imposed by the SS through their music. Despite not being strictly against the law at first, the swing scene was still deeply frowned upon by Nazi authorities. One of the biggest issues Nazis had with these groups was their acceptance of Jewish teenagers. However, this was never an intentionally political move on the part of the swing youth. They just wanted to dance and play music with their friends. The German-American journalist Hans-Jürgen Massaquoi, a biracial swing youth in Hamburg at the time, noted, "The Nazis hated our guts. Any chance they had, they would kick us in the pants or make life miserable for us. There was nothing ideological about us. We were non-political. Just anti-Nazi regimentation." But as time went on, it didn't matter why the swing youth rebelled against the status quo. The Gestapo began to consider any rebellion as a direct political attack against Nazi rule. One trademark of the swing youth that particularly irked the Gestapo was their greeting Swing Heil, a play on the traditional Nazi greeting of Sieg Heil, meaning Hail Victory. Thus, Swing Heil meant Hail Swing. As you can imagine, this was practically blasphemy to Hitler's supporters. A 1944 Reich Ministry of Justice report on the swing youth would sum up the Nazi brass view of them. The most striking example among these groups is the so-called swing youth, on whom there have been reports from various parts of the Reich. They began in Hamburg. These groups are motivated by the desire to have a good time and have increasingly assumed a character bordering on the criminal antisocial. Even before the war, boys and girls from Hamburg, from the socially privileged classes, joined groups wearing strikingly casual clothing and became fans of English music, i.e. American music and dance. At the turn of the year 1939 to 1940, the Flottbeck group organized dances which were attended by 5,000 to 6,000 young people, and which were marked by an uninhibited indulgence in swing. After the ban on public dances, they organized dances at home, which were marked above all by sexual promiscuity. The hunger for English dance music and for their own dance bands led to break-ins in shops selling musical instruments. The greed to participate in what appeared to them to be a stylish life in clubs, bars, cafes, and house balls suppressed any positive attitude towards responding to the needs of the time. They were unimpressed by the performance of our Wehrmacht. Those killed in action were sometimes held to ridicule. An attitude of hostility to the war is clearly apparent. The members dress in clothes which imitate English fashions. Thus, they often wear pleated jackets in tartan designs and carry umbrellas. As a badge, they wear a coloured dress shirt button in their lapels. They regard Englishmen as the highest form of human development. A false conception of freedom leads them into opposition to the Hitler Youth. And so it was that in 1940 the swing youth's lifestyle was officially criminalised. A police ordinance was decreed under the guise of protecting young people. Over the next 5.5 years, the Gestapo conducted raids wherever swing youth were caught gathering. And this is when the real acts of resistance among the swing youth kicked off. Teens and young adults viewed these laws as a severe infringement on their freedoms and personal life. One thing, perhaps universal across all cultures, is that you don't mess with kids' music if you don't want to get them really, really pissed off. While their actions didn't start as a political movement, the Nazis had, in fact, turned it into one. So these kids continued listening to their illegal music and dancing their forbidden dances. Nazis be damned. Word of the swing youth's rebellion against the Nazi regime reached the desk of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and in January of 1942 issued instructions to his officers that all the ringleaders and all teachers with enemy views who are encouraging the swing youth are to be assigned to a concentration camp. And so it was that by December 1942, nearly 400 people were arrested for their participation in swing culture, with roughly 90% of those arrested younger than 21. Although most were not convicted, nearly all spent weeks in jail and faced rather brutal interrogations by Gestapo officials who hoped to uncover more illicit swing rings. When the kids were sent home, their jazz records were confiscated and many of them were forced to have their hair cut short as a punishment. This short hair was a way to easily identify anyone who had stepped out of line and made it harder for them to get away with criminal activity later on. Some of the swing youth were even sent to the front lines, and Jewish swing kids endured the Holocaust. Because of this, many swing boys and girls died in the name of musical freedom. This now brings us to the final group that we're going to touch on today, the Zazaus, a group that shared similarities and in fact was likely greatly influenced by the swing youth and the Edelweiss pirates. Although what the Zazaus were rebelling against was actually the Vichy regime, which was the official government in France from 1940 to 1945. Half of the territory was occupied by Nazi Germany, and the Vichy regime actually worked in collaboration with the German officers, so any resistance against the Vichy regime would also be a direct snub at Nazi authorities. The group of young rebels derived their name from the song Za Zur Za by the American musician Cab Calloway. Calloway was also known for wearing zoot suits, which became another identifying feature of the Zazaus. As for their activities, the Zazaus gathered in cafes, clubs, parties, cinemas, and private homes in order to openly discuss their distaste for politics and the military state that they were now governed by. They further dressed in apparel that directly opposed what was deemed appropriate at the time. Rather than the neat tailored trim clothing that was mainstream due to government-endorsed fabric rationing regulations, the Zazaus wore oversized apparel, which usually contained an exorbitant amount of pockets, belts, and other embellishments. They got their extra material by stealing or black market means, or the upcycling of items they already owned. Another instruction issued by the government at the time pertained to hair. Barbershops were encouraged to collect hair trimmings which could be used to make things like slippers, so in retaliation, the Zazaus wore their hair long and generally refused to step foot in a barbershop. Further, when the regime began forcing homosexuals to wear pink badges to identify themselves, similar to Jews wearing the Yellow Star of David, the Zazaus made up their own badges, labelled with Zazal. And speaking of gay individuals, one French Zazal, 17-year-old Pierre Seal, along with his boyfriend, were deported to a German concentration camp for being homosexual. Noteworthy here is that homosexuality had not been illegal in France for almost a century and a half at this point, nor did the Vichy regime officially recriminalize it, though persecution of homosexuals under that government was rampant. As for Seal, in 1939, his watch had been stolen from a club frequented by gay men, and when he reported the theft to the police, they began investigating his reasons for being associated with that club, subsequently having his name added to the list of homosexuals by the police. 2 years later, the Gestapo were cracking down on suspected homosexuals in the region, and he was arrested and sent to a concentration camp. While there, he was tortured, including being sodomized with a piece of wood. Even more brutally, he was also forced to watch his boyfriend's execution via being publicly stripped naked and then devoured by attack dogs. Because Pierre was Catholic, and the authorities there later deemed that he had been successfully re-educated, he was ultimately released from the concentration camp for good behaviour and was able to return to France. That said, shortly thereafter he was forcibly conscripted and made to fight alongside the Germans on the Eastern Front. Not just supportive of gay individuals, another example of the Zazaus showing solidarity and rebelling against the norms was their representation of black culture. Under the guise of showing support for the black musicians they admired, some Zazaus would dress up in blackface. While this act might be misinterpreted today, at the time it was meant as a demonstration of solidarity and to annoy the Nazis. In the end, while their methods may have differed, and they certainly weren't alone, the White Rose, the Edelweiss Pirates, the Swing Youth, and the Zazaus all had one thing in common: standing up for their and others' freedom, to live their lives the way that they wanted to live them, despite being under the rule of arguably one of the most oppressive regimes in modern history. That's why Rose survivor Jürgen Wittgenstein would state, the government, or rather the party, controlled everything. The news media, arms, police, the armed forces, the judiciary system, communications, travel, all levels of education, from kindergarten to universities, all culture and religious institutions. Political indoctrination started at a very early age and continued by means of the Hitler Youth, with the ultimate goal of complete mind control. Children were exhorted in school to denounce even their own parents for derogatory remarks about Hitler or Nazi ideology. As the Allied armies advanced through France, Italy, and Eastern Europe, high-ranking officials and officers in the German National Socialist Party, the SS, and the Wehrmacht seem to have finally realized that taking on most of the largest industrialized countries in the world all at the same time had not been the wisest idea, and at this point there was a slight chance that their supposedly Aryan behinds could get a little spanking for being such naughty little Nazis. And while by virtue of being human, no doubt a percentage of them might have enjoyed the odd flogging session, let's just say not all of them were keen to assume the position and answer for their crimes. Especially if the position in question included getting choked out by a rope. The point is, while for some people that's all just a fun Saturday night, for these individuals, their crimes were such that they did not get to continue breathing afterwards. Which is kind of key. Silliness aside, even though this rabid extremist was fully aware that their Axis enemies knew of their rather extreme crimes against humanity, you can see our video for What Did the German Public Know About the Holocaust During World War II for more on that. As such, as the war was winding down and with the writing on the wall, many of the leaders among the Nazis, especially within the SS, started to draft plans for their escape to neutral and friendly nations in order to secure their livelihoods and their lives after the war. One of the top destinations recommended by Nazi Holiday Deals Inc. was Argentina, but this all brings up the question of all the places in the world they could potentially go, well, why Argentina? The massively oversimplified answer is because they found a friendly political regime held by Colonel-turned-President Juan Perón. The regime that, pretty much like every other nation in the world, including the US and Britain, was extremely eager to take in former Nazis in exchange for exploiting their military and technological expertise. That said, while that answer is not necessarily wrong, as ever the universe resists such simplicity, and the process which led Argentina to becoming a top destination for retired institutional mass murderers was long and complex, involving decades of German-Argentinian relationships and secret deals, most of which were uncovered only relatively recently by a relentless investigation by the journalist Uki Goni. So let's dive into that, shall we? Well, to begin with, Argentina's population increased from roughly 1.7 million inhabitants in 1869 to almost 8 million by 1914. The primary drivers behind this demographic leap forward was immigration, mainly from Italy and Spain, but a sizable number of those migrants, about 100,000, were also German speakers, either hailing from the motherland itself or belonging to the Volga German community. A short aside here, the Volga Germans were the descendants of German-speaking settlers imported by Catherine the Great into Russia. For various reasons, many of them relocated to North and South America, particularly resettling in Kansas, the Dakotas, and Nebraska in the United States, as well as Buenos Aires and the Entre Rios provinces of Argentina. By the 1920s in Argentina, the German community was doing rather well. Thousands of German Argentines made a good living as doctors, civil servants, teachers, farmers, or professional soldiers. They founded German schools and established strong links with the industrial sector back in the old country. The Argentine military took notice and recruited droves of German scientists and technicians to boost the local military-industrial complex. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the German presence in Argentina continued to grow, peaking at about 250,000 people. Over the same period, this community started exerting a mounting influence both over the military and political elites of their host country. Following Chief Naughty Boy Adolf Hitler's rise to power in early 1933, the Third Reich started extending its reach over the organizational structure of German-speaking communities in Argentina. Religious, educational, labor, social, even sporting and musical associations were infiltrated or altogether taken over by representatives of the Nazi Party, or more precisely, by the local chapter, denominated Argentine Landsgruppe. In German schools, children from Jewish or left-leaning families were partially driven off. Further, those deemed of satisfactory Aryan stock were encouraged to move to Germany upon coming of age so that they could work in the Wehrmacht or work in the resurgent arms industry. As the migrant communities were joined by opponents of the Nazi regime back at home, these late arrivals were intimidated and kept in line through propaganda efforts or just straight-up violence. Other propaganda campaigns were launched to collect funds from German communities, ostensibly for charitable purposes, but in reality to feed the Reichsbank with an influx of foreign currency. Those propaganda honchos at the Landsgruppe also managed to covertly influence local respected publications such as La Raison, or funded their own papers, which became a vehicle for open and rabid anti-Semitism. On this one, we feel compelled to point out to you, as ever, you'll often hear news today has gone off the rails, but this has always been the case as long as we have record of the news, with some publications known for being more objective and others being pretty unabashedly just propaganda tools for a given ideology. What's slightly unique in modern times is both the extreme reach such very clear propaganda outlets can have, and also how easy it is in modern times to fact-check anything said by any news outlet, regardless of quality. And on this one, nobody gets everything right all the time. That's impossible, just some do try harder than others. But what remains the same, regardless of era, is that few humans bother actually to look into it, and most of us would rather hear things that align with some version of what we already think. Despite all their work and initial influence, the Argentine Landsgruppe were never a huge organization. Their official membership peaked at only 2,110 in late 1936 and declined after that date. It appears that most German Argentines may have been initially strongly attracted by the nationalist rhetoric espoused by the Landsgruppe and had drawn some benefits from the labor associations it controlled. However, ultimately, the interest in Nazi ideology amongst ordinary citizens became lukewarm at best, as you might expect from a group living around, working with, marrying, and making friends with those from a completely different culture. When in the late 1930s, the general reputation of Hitler and friends started plummeting worldwide, German Argentines doubled down and on the whole preferred not to associate themselves too closely with the regime. Matters didn't improve with, in March 1938, the Anschluss, or annexation of Austria, which was strongly negatively perceived by public opinion in the region. 1 year later came another blow, known as the Patagonia Affair. On this one, in March of 1939, President Roberto Ortiz was made aware of a dossier revealing a secret plan to annex Patagonia. The dossier was actually a fake, a hoax cooked up by British intelligence with the likely cooperation of local communists and American journalists. Ortiz was skeptical of the evidence, but the uproar caused by the scandal prompted him to impose restrictions on foreign language associations, including, of course, the Argentine Landsgruppe and the organizations it controlled. The German Argentine Nazis wisely decided to act more discreetly, from then on rebranding themselves as the Federation of German Circles of Beneficence and Culture. Now let's return to President Roberto Ortiz for a moment. At the outset of World War II, he declared himself to be a pro-Allied leader who strove to make local politics more open and democratic. His tenure, however, was marred by accusations of fraud and some, let's say, severe ambiguity. For example, shortly after taking office in July 1938, his government had issued the secret Directive 11, which instructed consular officers to not issue visas to Jewish immigrants. This directive remained in effect throughout the war, effectively preventing thousands of Jewish families from escaping persecution and murder in Nazi-occupied Europe. Granted, the vast majority of other nations in the world likewise weren't too bothered to help by opening up their doors, but at least most stopped short of actively banning taking Jews in, just generally making the process difficult, despite the very well-known persecution that was happening in Germany at the time, and that the vast majority of Jews wanted out for obvious reasons, and Germany itself was happy, at least at first, to let them go. That actually being part of the original plan, rather than the mass executions that followed, simply make life so miserable for the Jews they'd all leave. Except, what the Nazi brass didn't quite count on in their planning was that most had nowhere to go. For example, the United States, despite its surface-level supposed give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free thing, and the extreme success the US once had with more open immigration policies being a boon to the country, but at this point they had a hard limit of 153,744 immigrants annually. This, in turn, was divided by country with an awful lot of entry requirements to qualify on top of that. These requirements were so strict that many quotas during this time weren't filled at at all despite massively more applicants than that number. Further, again, despite well-known news of the atrocities being committed against the Jews leading up to the war, the majority of the American public opposed relaxing immigration guidelines or boosting numbers for the Jews to accommodate those desperately wanting out of Germany. This was a rather curious thing in the nation, given at the time, according to the Pew Research Center, 91% of Americans identified as Christian. Well, why does that matter? Well, when Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment was, he responded, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. When then asked who your neighbor is to love, the response was the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which a Samaritan comes across a severely injured person, implied to be a Jew, and sees to it that he's taken care of when others would not. Important to the story at hand, and a context often lost on modern readers and clearly lost on the 1940s populace of many then Christian nations, is that the Samaritans and Jews at the time were hated enemies. But the Samaritan took him in anyway. In the end, not even needing to get metaphorical with this one on all the interesting implications of what being implied with the story, if we just want to go literal, it's a story of a foreign individual taking in a Jew because the Jew was desperately in need of help. And this whole love thy neighbor thing quite literally was, as noted, the second most important commandment according to Jesus himself. Yet the general public of not just the US, but most of the world, mostly opposed the notion. On this note, other countries more or less mimicked this general stance, with Britain, who, by the way, at the time had 83% of the populace identifying as Christian, even going further and taking steps to actively reduce the number of German Jews who were being allowed to immigrate to Palestine at the time, which was one of the few places that was taking a relatively large number of Jewish immigrants in compared to most countries. That said, in 1938, Britain did agree to amend a policy and take in 10,000 Jewish children, but made no special provisions for taking any Jewish adults outside of the already established normal immigration procedures. The point being, while Argentina's stance with regards to taking in Jewish refugees was perhaps a bit more extreme with Directive 11, quite literally almost every other nation in the world was likewise at the same time collectively saying, yeah, no thanks, even knowing what was going on in Germany. Although perhaps this shouldn't be much of a surprise, given that even today this collective not my problem attitude with regards to accepting persecuted refugees from troubled nations is still very much a common thing the world over. Despite, the fact that we're all humans, and regardless of your religious ideology or even your stance on immigration, most would otherwise agree humans helping humans in trouble is nearly always the right thing to do. Maybe Jesus was on to something with this one. But going back to Argentina in all of this, Ortiz and his successors, Raymond Castillo, Arturo Rawson, and Pedro Pablo Ramirez, never broke off friendly relations with the Axis, despite publicly professing neutrality. During this time, Allied nations, the US chief amongst them, likewise suspected that Argentina and Germany had something of a special relationship. Further, in November of 1942, the US Undersecretary of State, Sumner Welles, began voicing his concern that German minorities in Argentina might retain political influence even in the case of Allied victory. All of this prompted the special section of the State Department's Division of American Republics to initiate an investigation on what they defined as the condition of German groups. On this, a special section report of July 1943 noted the strong economic position retained by Germans in Latin America and Argentina in particular, warning about the probable existence of a Nazi underground, and perhaps exaggerating and overblown, insisted that a Fourth Reich might rise in Buenos Aires after the inevitable defeat of Hitler in Europe. However, while the American Department of State was worried about German presence in Argentina, their counterparts at the British Foreign Office, curiously, had a different view. In December 1943, British diplomats held talks with Colonel and future President Juan Perón, in which he revealed his intention to import large numbers of German technicians to boost local industry. Apparently, the Foreign Office liked the idea. Throughout 1944 and 1945, its officials came to the conclusion that once the Nazi threat was dealt with, thousands of skilled German and Austrian labourers should be transplanted to Argentina. In their view, this would have ensured an orderly development of the local economy and counterbalance excessive US influence. At the same time, the US State Department was busy at work preventing that occurrence. One of their tactics was to launch smear campaigns against German and Austrian tycoons who set up businesses in Argentina, with one of their favorite targets being Austrian arms manufacturer Fritz Mandl, better known as the former husband of Hollywood goddess Hedy Lamarr. In this, Mandl was accused of preparing refuge and business opportunities for fleeing Nazi hierarchs. Mandl had in fact had dealings with both Hitler and Mussolini in the 1930s, but by the time he'd moved to Argentina, had fallen out of favour with the Nazi regime to the point that most of his assets had been expropriated. This was due to a personal enmity with Hermann Goering, as well as another tiny detail, the fact that he was Jewish. In any event, around late 1944, Gerald Warner, an intelligence asset stationed at the American Embassy in Buenos Aires, started tracking down rumors concerning the escape of prominent Nazis to Argentina. Finally, in 1945, Warner was able to pin down the source of those rumors, which might have enabled him to prove the long-standing suspicions of the State Department. On this, surprisingly, these tales of Nazi escapees originated from a radio transmitter located near London. So, what was going on here? Well, Warner inquired with the Foreign Office, and the mystery was revealed. It was all part of a clever scheme run by Sefton Delmer, the maestro of so-called British black propaganda. Delmer had set up a bogus radio service, the German Soldiers Station, which broadcast fake news in German to shatter the morale of the Wehrmacht. One of their mock reports involved officers and party officials squirreling away to Argentina, shedding their lederhosen and deserting the poor Hanses and Ottos still slugging it out in Europe. Delmer was truly a genius when it came to using propaganda and psychological manipulation against tyranny. Such a genius, in fact, that in concocting this hilarious plot, he unwittingly stumbled upon the truth. And it's now time to bring to center stage the two characters who mostly contributed to Argentina becoming a pleasant alternative to the hangman's noose for Axis war criminals. The first, as alluded to, Juan Perón, the army officer who became president on June 4, 1946, but who had been the puppet master of Argentinian politics well before that date. Perón liked to portray himself as a friend of the poorer echelons of society, a defender of the have-nots against the elites. He was, in fact, a savvy populist leader who surfed the waves of popular discontent thanks to his own charisma and the popularity of his wife, the legendary Evita. In reality, Perón was a great supporter of Italian fascism and German Nazism, regimes he had come to admire while he had trained with Mussolini's Alpine troops in 1939 and while serving as a military attaché in Rome and Berlin. Back in Buenos Aires, while affecting himself as a defender of the working class, Perón sought friendship and support among the upper classes. One of his chief supporters was German banker Ludwig Freud, who would channel large contributions from the local German community into Perón's 1945 and 1946 presidential campaign. Back in March 1945, following increased pressure from the Allies, the Argentinian government, under President Farrell, broke their neutrality and declared war on the Axis. Most of the officers who supported the government, however, did not hide their sympathies for Berlin, leading to internecine tensions which erupted into violent clashes between pro- and anti-Nazi factions. The latter faction called for a purge of suspected Nazi agents, Ludwig Freud being one of them. The banker was arrested on September 6, 1945, but Perón came to the rescue. He first negotiated a house arrest sentence and then prevented the expulsion of Freud by forging a letter attesting Argentinian citizenship for his friend. In October, following more anti-Nazi protests, Farrell's government decided to get rid of Perón to further prevent unrest. This time, Freud came to the rescue, or rather, his son, Rodolfo, known as Rudy, who spirited Perón and Evita away from Buenos Aires and into a safe house. Eventually, Evita exploited Juan's new aura of martyrdom to rally popular support, leading to a massive demonstration on October the 17th. Farrell was forced to release, who was from then on dead set on becoming the new president. The events of September and October 1945 cemented the alliance between the Perons and the Freuds. Dad Ludwig continued to bankroll Perón, while his son Rudy would become his first personal secretary and later chief of intelligence. In early 1946, the Ludwig-Rudy-Juan trio began to plot the first so-called rat lines from Germany to Argentina. While the full extent of connections and dealings is a vast spiderweb, as for some notable points, during that period, Ludwig made contact with a former Nazi spy master stationed in Argentina, SS Captain Siegfried Becker. Becker was still in contact with former SS intelligence officers hiding in Francoist Spain. Through them, he was able to channel funds from Madrid to Buenos Aires. Using such funds, young Rudy and Perón set about trying to rescue as many Axis escapees as possible. As early as February 1946, Rudy Freud unleashed his tentacles to Europe, dispatching messages to Madrid, Denmark, Sweden, and the Vatican, seeking to recruit travel agents and establish safe escape pathways. One of the first rat lines to become active was the Scandinavian route. According to CIA declassified reports, as early as July 1946, Danish and Swedish police were already on the trail of this organization, which enjoyed active support and coordination from Argentinian diplomatic officials. On this Nazi Underground Railroad, former Nazi officers and officials first convened to the port city of Hamburg. From there, they were smuggled to Denmark. Here, they received help from the Argentinian embassy in Copenhagen, described by the CIA as intimately involved in the illegal immigration. However, its interest appeared to have been mainly financial, i.e. the payments to the legation of considerable sums of money upon safe delivery of the bodies to Argentina. Two officials in particular, Councillor Carlos R. Pinheiro and First Secretary Ricardo Fernandez Mira, eagerly issued Argentine passports to suitable Germans. The plot was well known to the Danish government, so much so that the local foreign ministry requested the expulsion of these two diplomats. However, even once Pinheiro and Fernandes were out of the picture, escapees could count on similar levels of aid in Sweden, as the Argentinian embassy in Stockholm was likewise involved, with official Hector Russo personally implicated in all steps of the smuggling operation. The Swedish leg of this rat line involved other key cogs, starting with a young Stockholm photographer called Torkel Lindenberg, also an employee at the passport division of the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Lindenberg was arrested by the Swedish police in the summer of 1947 on charges of forging passports to the benefit of Nazi escapees. Upon questioning, he confessed to arranging fake passports for two Norwegian nationals who had collaborated with the German occupation forces. Following Lindenberg's arrest in November 1947, the Swedish detectives busted one Carlos Werner Eduardo Schulz, an Argentine citizen of German birth. Schulz confessed to hiring recruits, preferably Nazis, for the Argentine army. He further stated that the Argentine government has been paying most of the expenses of the recruits. According to local newspaper Expressen, Schulz worked alongside one Caspar Kruger, former member of the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, composed of volunteers from Scandinavia, Estonia, Finland, Belgium, and the Netherlands. To the surprise of absolutely no one, Kruger was known to be active in smuggling Nazis via Denmark and Sweden to Argentina. The CIA reports note how the Swedish police somehow left Schulz off the hook, as in January 1948 he was able to board the ship Falcon, destined for an unknown South American port. Falcon should be considered a character of this story in her own right. This small and elegant sailing yacht was a training ship of the Swedish Navy, which had somehow been enlisted in the smuggling operations. In a clever ploy, the Falcon would leave Stockholm with a regularly registered crew and then stop at Gothenburg to pick up her illegal passengers. The yacht would then sail on toward the safe Francoist haven of Coruna, a port city in northwestern Spain. That was the last stop before leisurely sailing on towards a life of freedom in Argentina. And all of this, while many at this point might be getting out the pitchforks and torches against Argentina, we feel compelled to point out that many of the customers of the Scandinavian rat lines were German jet plane designers and other such skilled individuals. And such importation of former Nazi engineers was something pretty much every prominent nation in the world was trying to do just as vigorously, such as the United States in Operation Paperclip, which saw the US import about 1,600 such individuals. And indeed, after defeating Japan, the US made similar deals with the heads of the infamous Unit 731, which made the Nazis look like amateurs in systematic brutality. Not just a full cover-up of what they did and being let off scot-free, the US even went further and paid them for some of their research. The US likewise very systematically made sure the Japanese imperial family got off scot-free both in the courts and also, as best as possible, in public perception in trying to downplay their role, despite the emperor having led the entire thing and seemingly ordering or very well aware of the extreme atrocities committed by his forces. In a nutshell, the US wanted the data and experts for future use against the Soviets and didn't mind looking the other way about what any of these people got up to during the war. And the imperial family staying in place ensured an easy transition in Japan to a government there that aligned with US interests. But going back to importing Nazis, in a nutshell, to steal a line from every kid caught doing something they probably shouldn't have been, well, everyone was doing it. On that note, going back to Argentina, among all the engineers and scientists and physicians, there were some rather extreme bad apples, such as SS Dr. Karl Warnert, also known as the Danish Mengele. This deranged physician believed he had found a cure for homosexuality, which of course it experimented with on unwilling subjects forcibly recruited in concentration camps. During his so-called research, Warnert did things like insert metal tubes into his victims' nether regions, releasing testosterone to drive the gay away. Warnert had actually been arrested by Danish police, but was temporarily released to seek heart treatment in Sweden. Once in Stockholm, he gingerly boarded a regular commercial flight to Geneva, and from there he managed to reach Buenos Aires in March of 1947. Also noteworthy, while Warnert may have been the Danish Mengele, the actual Mengele, Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death himself, also managed to make it to Argentina. On this one, we'll spare you the gruesome details, but beyond directing countless thousands to their deaths, including helping to decide who was assigned to work detail, who to human experimentation, and who to the gas chambers, as well as one of the doctors overseeing the mass murders in the gas chambers, Mengele also was one of the ones doing human experimentation in rather gruesome and horrific ways, and noted, unlike many others doing similar work, as doing it all rather cheerily, even whilst occasionally reportedly whistling while he worked. As for how he managed to get off scot-free for it all, unlike his Japanese counterparts in Unit 731, rather than making a deal with the US for his research, he simply fled shortly before the Soviet armed forces captured Auschwitz on January 27, 1945. Afterwards, he first traveled around occupied German territories, evading Soviet and American forces while carrying with him several boxes of medical records. During this time, he seems to have primarily worked as a farmhand until he went to Genoa in 1949, and then a few months later he took sanctuary in Argentina. His wife Irene refused to go with him, and they divorced. Argentina is where Mengele lived the next 5 years of his life or so, mostly under a false name, working as a small pharmaceutical business owner and farmer. After an incident where a girl he tried to perform an abortion on died, he fled for Paraguay. In May 1961, the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency whose job it was to track down Nazi war criminals and bring them to Israel for trial, captured Adolf Eichmann. They then turned their attention to Mengele. During the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946, Mengele's name was mentioned several times, but Allied forces thought that he was dead. The Mossad knew otherwise. Much later, it is almost universally thought that the Mossad had found Mengele living in Sao Paulo in Brazil in 1962. Due to budgetary concerns and the ongoing dispute with Egypt, the Mossad could not pursue him. Mengele went on to live another 17 years in relative seclusion and deteriorating health, with recently published journal entries indicating that he never changed his political ideologies nor showed any remorse for his actions. Mengele ultimately had a stroke in 1976 and died in 1979. He was buried under the false name Wolfgang Gerhard in Brazil. It wasn't until 1992 that authorities exhumed the body, and DNA proved that this Wolfgang was in fact Joseph Mengele, Auschwitz's angel of death. In any event, going back to the rat lines that helped get Mengele and his buddies to Argentina, following the arrests of Schulz and Lindeberg, the Nordic rat line effectively ceased to exist, contributing to the rise of the popularity of southern routes. Some of the most active escape lines went through Spain. Dictator Francisco Franco had remained neutral during World War II, and the leader himself was open to getting cozier with Washington, but it is undeniable that his regime was ideologically aligned and sympathetic to the former Nazi regime. CIA declassified reports described two organizations active in Spain in the smuggling of Nazi criminals of the war and collaborators. The first was a Franco-Spanish religious order, the Congregation of Christ the King. The congregation would disguise escapees as priests and hide them in various French monasteries before smuggling them into Spain. According to the report, these escape lines were organized by two doctors identified simply as Monic and Vidal. Further, it appears that if the Nazis on the run were arrested on the Franco-Spanish frontier, they would be set free simply by using a password. Once in Spain, Monic and Vidal would hand their human contraband to a priest of the congregation, one Father Valete. The father took care of helping them, if possible, to get to the Argentine. For this endeavor, he could count on the help of three individuals working at the French embassy in Madrid. Two priests, Boyer-Mars and Petit, and Francis Pietri, former Vichy ambassador to Spain. For context, the French state, or Vichy France, was the collaborationist rump state set up by Nazi Germany following their defeat of the French Republic. The second escape organization was entirely manned by German citizens and was headquartered in Barcelona. The outfit included another priest identified as Padre Booz, two bookshops, and one photographer. The author of the report, however, admits that we know nothing of the workings of the organization, except that one of the bookshops provided clothing vouchers which could be redeemed at a local department store. Madrid in late 1946 and early 1947 was a hotbed for ratline runners. Some of them had been dispatched to the Spanish capital as early as April 1945 by the SD, the Intelligence and Security Services of the SS. Even before Freud and Perón had launched their own initiative, Nazi chiefs such as Heinrich Himmler and Walter Schellenberg had explored the idea of using Francoist Spain as a launch pad to free to warmer, friendlier climates. Among the first operatives to land in Madrid was Carlos Foldner, an SS captain with dual German and Argentinian citizenship, which shows that Nazi leadership were already considering Buenos Aires as a possible safe haven. This prescient move proved fruitful, as Foldner became one of the first and most active agents within the Freud-Perón network. Foldner was instrumental in recruiting technical advisors for the Argentinian Air Force, but is best remembered for securing the escape of refined gentlemen such as Erich Priebke, wanted by Italian authorities for the massacre of 335 political prisoners and civilians in Rome, and also the architect of the final solution himself, Adolf Eichmann. Another ratliner present in Madrid since April 1945 was the Italo-Croatian Count of Valsacina, Gino Monti, responsible for the escape of wanted Luftwaffe General Erhard Kramer and arms dealer Reinhard Spitzi. Monti was just one of the many non-German operatives within the network recruited amongst other Axis powers or collaborators within German-occupied countries, especially France and Belgium. Another hub of the Perón ratlines was established in that smallest of countries, Vatican City. The cooperation between Catholic institutions in Buenos Aires Aires was first initiated by Argentinian Cardinal Antonio Cagano. At the end of March 1946, the clergyman was ostensibly admitted to a clinic in Rome, but this was just cover for him to conduct talks with the Pontifical Commission of Assistance, or PCA, a body in charge of providing assistance and identity papers to legitimate refugees in need of relocation. As a result of Cagano's intervention, the PCA began providing their services also to German, Italian, French, and Croatian war criminals. Cagano was not shy about stating his intentions when dealing with the French Cardinal Tisserand to quote, "The government of the Argentine Republic was willing to receive French persons whose political attitude during the war would expose them, should they return to France, to harsh measures and private revenge." End quote. The Argentinian cardinal was clearly referring to Vichy collaborators, but the same sentiment could be applied to any other Nazi and Nazi-adjacent escapee. In parallel to Cagano's agreement with the PCA, Argentine diplomacy was tackling the same issue with the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Montini, future Pope Paul VI. In June 1946, Montini met with the Argentinian ambassador, stating that the current Pope, Pius XII, was interested in arranging the emigration to Argentina of individuals held at POW camps in Italy. According to the aforementioned author and journalist Uki Goni, this was a subtle reference to Nazi officers in Allied custody. The extent of Pius XII's involvement in supporting Nazism and fascism during and after the war is still the subject of debate. What is undeniable, however, is the great lengths to which the Catholic Church helped Axis war criminals escape via the infamous monastery route. This was a network of religious institutions snaking through southern Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Italy, which offered shelter, food, clothing, and funds to German escapees. The last leg of the journey through this route was normally the port city of Genoa in northern Italy. There, with the help of ex-fascists and the local bishop, escapees were able to board a ship towards Buenos Aires. We will not go into details of every single rat line, every single escapee, nor every single smuggler who helped them to safety, as an entire YouTube channel would not be sufficient to cover that. And we realise we've barely scratched the surface of this complex, fascinating, and ultimately sinister topic. If you want to learn more, we recommend the fantastic book The Real Odessa, How Nazi War Criminals Escaped Europe, written by Argentinian journalist Uki Goni, first published in 2002. It was thanks to Goni's archival and investigative work that the true extent of Perón's involvement in creating the rat lines first came to light. But to sum up, while many things went into it, Argentina was picked by many Nazis thanks to a strong German community in Argentina that had laid the groundwork for establishing close ties within the military, industrial, and banking sectors of the two countries. In the 1930s, Nazi ideology had extended its reach all over Latin America, planting the seeds of anti-Semitism and a fascination with totalitarianism. While these seeds may have ultimately been mostly rejected by public opinion and the civilian elements within the government, they continued to fester amongst the real power base behind the scenes, the high-ranking officers and officials. As World War II progressed, the Argentinian government was pressured into declaring war on the Axis. But again, the real sympathies of Chief Puppet Master Juan Perón lay with Berlin. As he achieved the top position, he forged an alliance with a powerful family of German bankers with ties to Nazi intelligence, and they all shared the same goal as many nations at the time: saving Axis talent from trial and execution, talent which may have proven useful to advance the Argentinian military-industrial complex. Luckily for them, in the last weeks of the war, Nazi leadership had already identified the Madrid-Buenos Aires route as a viable lifeline to avoid capture and execution, which greatly facilitated the establishment of the most successful rat lines. Now, before we bow out today, let us introduce one final element. In his taped memoirs, Perón would later admit that the event that finally triggered him to sponsor the rat lines operations was the Nuremberg trials. To him, the notion of high-ranking German officers and officials being tried as ordinary criminals was plain unthinkable, hence the decision to try and save as many of them as possible from incarceration and execution. A fascinating aside to point out on this one is, while there was the Nuremberg trials, obviously, and an equivalent Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, there was no equivalent Italian Nuremberg, despite many of the individuals in charge there being guilty of similar war crimes and crimes against humanity. As to why not, well, that's a fascinating story that we'll cover another day. And now for a bonus fact. Speaking of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal and countries of the world seemingly far more interested in things they wanted after the war rather than justice being done, let's just say the US was perhaps the poster child of this following World War II, not just with Operation Paperclip importing countless Nazis for their expertise, but most egregiously in Japan, where the literal Hitler or Mussolini of Japan, Emperor Showa or Hirohito if you prefer, was protected at all costs by the US military brass in the aftermath, despite that before this he was painted with the same brush as Hitler by that same brass. In the end, after the war, they did everything in their power to have the general public abroad perceive Emperor Showa as having been nothing but a figurehead during the war, still a common notion in popular history in the United States, rather than the reality that he was one of the chief directors of it, and very definitively well aware of what was going on and the atrocities his armies were committing in places like China, as well as giving some of the orders which guided such policy of conduct. And you can watch our 2-hour documentary, Swept Under the Rug, The Truth About the Japanese Holocaust, for more on that one. But briefly, while one member of the imperial family, Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, who the US also made sure got off scot-free, oversaw and was co-commanding the absolutely brutal rape of Nanjing directly, another, Prince Mikasa, brother to Emperor Showa, went the other way and entreated the emperor to put a stop to all of it. Prince Mikasa even gave a scathing public speech to Nanjing soldiers condemning the mass rape and massacres that were seemingly commonplace from what he saw in China. Unfortunately, this speech was covered up, with most of the copies of it being destroyed by the army and his appeals to the commanders to put a stop to it ignored. While anyone else who gave such a speech to the Japanese army at the time would likely have been executed for treason, because such criticism of the army during the war was considered such, Prince Mikasa states, "I could make such bold statements because of my status as a member of the imperial family." Prince Mikasa, who lived to 100 years old, dying in 2016, would later state in an interview, "I was really shocked when an officer told me that the best way to train new soldiers was to use living prisoners of war for bayonet practice because it gave them willpower." The prince also toured Unit 731 and saw what they were doing there, including being shown films of Chinese prisoners who, to quote him, were made to march on the plains of Manchuria for poison gas experiments on humans. After this, the prince showed Emperor Showa a video of various atrocities being committed in China by Japanese soldiers to appeal to him once again to put a stop to it, but this too was ignored. So why did the US spare the emperor and do everything in their power to change public perception of him? Well, as alluded to, they needed him to help make a smooth transition into a new US interests-aligned government in Japan, and on the flip side, prosecuting him for extreme crimes against humanity would have also likely caused some trouble in Japan, given the emperor was still beloved by the people. Thus, they decided to spare him and his entire family if he was willing to play along, which he seemingly was. As so it was that during the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, systematic efforts were made to ensure that the emperor remained blameless, including making arrangements for who would take the blame for some of the emperor's decisions and coaching the individuals beforehand towards this end, something the individuals involved seemed happy to do. Again, loyalty to the emperor was a huge thing at this time. There were, however, a few hiccups. For example, Prime Minister General Tojo Hideki, who was very happy to accept this primary blame game role to protect the emperor, at one point during testimony briefly slipped up and stated that the emperor had ultimate authority. This slip saw the prosecution, led by the US, see to it that Tojo was further coached by one General Rikichi Tanaka to change his testimony on that point, which he did.
For much of its recent history, the North American continent has benefited greatly from its geographic isolation, being separated from hostile nations by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The protective moat proved especially useful during the Second World War, allowing American-Canadian factories to churn out vast quantities of material almost entirely unmolested by enemy forces. The few attacks the Axis did manage to launch against the continent were insignificant and had almost no effect on the conflict. On the west coast, Japanese operations consisted of a few dozen shells fired by submarines against shore targets in California and British Columbia, and the launch of 9,300 Fugo incendiary balloons across the Pacific. However, few of those balloons reached the continent, and those that did caused negligible damage and only 6 deaths, as we previously covered when we visited the site of that attack a few years back. The East Coast, meanwhile, was even quieter. Though early in the war, German U-boats sank a significant number of Allied ships off the American coast, the only Germans to actually land in the country were the 8 spies and saboteurs of Operation Pistorius in June of 1942. However, the operation was almost immediately betrayed by its ringleader before it could do any damage. The only other German landing on the continent took place in northern Labrador in October of 1943 and was so secret that it remained forgotten for nearly 4 decades. This is the strange tale of Weather Station Kurt, the only armed Nazi operation ever carried out on North American soil. In the Second World War, as throughout all of history, weather was king of the battlefield. Military forces needed accurate weather forecasts in order to successfully successfully plan all manner of operations, from aerial bombing raids to naval maneuvers. In this field, the Germans were at a significant disadvantage, for at northern latitudes, weather patterns typically move west to east, meaning the Allies could obtain forecasts hours ahead of their enemy. Before the war, the Germans attempted to solve this problem by building a network of manned weather stations across the North Atlantic, including in Greenland and Iceland. However, at the outbreak of hostilities, these installations were quickly discovered and captured by the Allies. The Germans thus turned to weather ships, U-boats, and aircraft to collect meteorological data, but these proved of limited utility. German aircraft had limited range, and broadcasting regular weather reports made ships and U-boats highly vulnerable to detection and attack. Indeed, it was this very vulnerability that allowed the Allies to make one of the greatest intelligence coups of the war. While weather ships transmitted their reports uncoded, they were nonetheless equipped with Enigma cipher machines and codebooks to translate messages transmitted from German naval headquarters. In 1941, British codebreaker Harry Hinsley realized that if one of these unarmed and unprotected vessels could be captured quickly enough, its codebooks could be recovered before the crew had time to destroy them. The Royal Navy duly dispatched a flotilla of 7 destroyers and cruisers to the coast of Iceland, where in May 1941 they captured the German weather ship Mullen. The codebooks captured from the ship allowed the Allies to decode nearly all German weather traffic during the month of June. A month later, another flotilla was dispatched and captured the weather ship Lauenburg, along with its codebooks for the month of July. These operations yielded valuable information about German encipherment procedures, allowing the Allies to continue cracking Enigma messages without the need for further captures. With their manned meteorological network fully compromised, the Germans came up with an ingenious solution: the Wetterfungerät Land, or Weather Radio Device Land. Designed by Dr. Ernst Plotzer and Edwin Stobe and manufactured by the Siemens Company, the WFL was an automatic weather station designed to be secretly deployed in remote areas throughout the North Atlantic. The device comprised 10 cylindrical metal canisters, each 47 centimeters in diameter and 1.5 meters long. One canister had meteorological instruments, including a thermometer, barometer, anemometer, and wind vane mounted on a short mast, while another held a Lorenz 150 radio transmitter and a 10-meter antenna mast. The other 8 canisters held nickel-cadmium batteries capable of powering the station for up to 6 months. The WFL was designed to transmit weather readings in Morse code every 3 hours at a frequency of 3,940 kHz, each transmission lasting around 2 minutes. The modular design of the station was to allow for easier transport aboard a U-boat. In total, 21 WFLs were manufactured by Siemens, 14 were deployed around the Arctic, including in Greenland, Spitsbergen, and Franz Josef Land, while 5 were hidden around the Barents Sea near Russia. The last 2 were intended for the east coast of North America, as far west as the Germans could reach. And so it was that on September the 18th, 1943, the Type 9 U-boat U-537, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Peter Schroe, left its base in Lorient, France, and sailed out into the Atlantic. Aboard were Siemens technicians Dr. Kurt Sommermeyer and Walter Hildebrand, and weather station WFL-26, nicknamed Kurt after Sommermeyer, the senior of the 2 technicians. The month-long journey across the Atlantic to North America was a harrowing one, with the U-boat encountering a violent storm during which it collided with an iceberg. The collision ripped off the submarine's anti-aircraft gun and damaged the hull, leaving it unable to dive or defend itself against Allied aircraft. Nonetheless, U-537 made the crossing undetected, and on October the 22nd arrived at Marin Bay, Labrador, just 6 degrees south of the Arctic Circle, in what was then the independent Dominion of Newfoundland. The remote, windswept site was chosen to minimize the risk of the weather station being discovered by Allied ships or local Inuit people. Captain Schroe dropped anchor off the shore and sent ashore a small scouting party, who soon found an ideal site about half a kilometer inland. The components of the weather station, along with Sommermeyer, Hildebrandt, and 10 sailors, were then ferried ashore in rubber rafts. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew worked to repair the storm damage to the submarine. While armed lookouts guarded the site, the sailors and technicians assembled and tested the weather station. The camouflage of the station was painted with white splotches to blend in with the snow-flecked landscape, while American cigarette cartons were strewn about the site to give the impression that it was an Allied military installation. In a final, rather misguided attempt at deception, one of the canisters was also stenciled with the words Canadian Meteor Service, despite the fact that A, no such organisation existed, and B, at the time Labrador was not even a part of Canada, not becoming a province until 1949. The assembly process was slow and tedious, the short daylight hours forcing the crew to work in near darkness and bitter cold. Less than 28 hours later, however, the team finished and returned to the newly repaired submarine. At 5:40 p.m. on October the 23rd, U-537 weighed anchor and sailed south for the Labrador Sea. There, the radio operator picked up the first scheduled transmission from Weather Station Kirk, confirming that the installation was working as designed. However, it was not to last. Within only a few days, the station's transmissions began to degrade. Within 3 weeks, it had ceased to transmit altogether. It had been speculated that faulty batteries or Allied radio jamming was responsible for Kurt's failure, although there is no evidence the Allies ever became aware of the station's existence. Meanwhile, U-537 embarked on regular anti-shipping patrol off the shore of Newfoundland. Though she sank no ships, she survived 3 attacks by Allied aircraft, returning safely to Lorient December the 8th. Their technicians, Kurt Sommermeyer and Walter Hildebrandt, along with 1 crewman, disembarked before the U-boat was refitted and sent out for its next patrol, this time to the Far East. 11 months later, on November the 11th, 1944, U-537 was torpedoed by the American submarine USS Flounder and sunk with all hands near the Dutch East Indies. With all but 3 men involved in the installation now dead, Weather Station Kurt was promptly forgotten about and lay abandoned in its remote northern bay, silent and rusting for nearly 4 decades. It wasn't until 1977 that Canadian geomorphologist Peter Johnson stumbled upon the remains of the long-forgotten Nazi operation. Johnson was part of the Torn Ghat Archaeological Project, an initiative by the Smithsonian Institution and Bryn Mawr College to survey archaeological sites and collect geological and botanical data along the Labrador coast. Johnson, unaware of what he had discovered, assumed the station was a Canadian military installation and gave the site the designation Martin Bay 7 before moving out. Meanwhile, in Germany, a retired Siemens engineer named Franz Sellinger was writing a history of the company. In the course of his research, Sellinger stumbled upon Dr. Kurt Sommermeyer's papers, which contained photographs of an automatic weather station being deployed by U-boats somewhere in the Arctic. The photographs did not match any installations Sellinger had previously identified, suggesting that this was a previously unknown mission. Sellinger was eventually able to narrow down the location to the coast of Labrador, but neither the American nor Canadian military authorities had any knowledge of the station. It was only with the help of Dr. Sommermeyer's son that Sellinger was able to identify the U-boat as U-537 and track down the submarine's logbook in an archive in Freiburg. With the station's exact location in hand, Sellinger then contacted historian W.A.B. Douglas of the Canadian Department of Defense, who visited Martin Bay in 1981. He found the station still largely intact, though several canisters had been opened and their contents scattered by scrap metal hunters. The remains of Weather Station Kurt were recovered and restored and are now on display at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. The unassuming collection of grey canisters and masts stands as a reminder of the surprisingly vital role played by meteorology during the Second World War.
200 kilometers off the coast of Mozambique lies the island nation of Madagascar. With a land area of 587,000 square kilometers, it is the 4th largest island in the world after Greenland, New Guinea and Borneo, and the 2nd largest island nation after Indonesia. A French colony from 1896 to 1960, Madagascar has long been the world's primary producer of vanilla and cloves, though today the island is primarily known as a biodiversity and ecotourism hotspot, with 90% of its wildlife, including the famous ring-tailed lemur, being found nowhere else. But Madagascar once came close to having a much darker claim to fame: the world's largest concentration camp. In the early days of the Second World War, the Nazis briefly considered solving the so-called Jewish problem by deporting all of Europe's Jews to the African island and forcibly holding them there under brutal conditions. While this plan was short-lived, it was instrumental in the eventual adoption of the final solution, which resulted in the systematic murder of nearly 6 million Jews. This is the story of the forgotten prelude to the Holocaust. The idea of deporting or encouraging the emigration of European Jews to Africa, and Madagascar in particular, long predates the Third Reich and was actively promoted by pro- and anti-Jewish groups alike. Among the first to suggest such a plan was German Orientalist scholar Paul de Lagarde, who detailed his proposal in his 1878 work Deutschschriften, or German Writings. Indeed, de Lagarde's ideas regarding anti-Semitism, anti-slavism, social Darwinism, and territorial expansionism are considered instrumental to the development of Nazi ideology. In 1903, British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain proposed the creation of a Jewish homeland in Uganda, then a colony of British East Africa. Chamberlain's motives for promoting this plan were threefold. First, the rising number of pogroms or anti-Semitic riots in Eastern Europe, including the Kishinev pogrom of April 19th to the 21st, 1903, had resulted in a wave of Jewish immigration to the United Kingdom. Not only was Chamberlain genuinely concerned for the welfare of Eastern European Jews, but he sought to protect the jobs of native British workers from a sudden influx of Jewish immigrants. Second, the Uganda Railway, built between 1895 and 1901, had proven an exorbitantly expensive boondoggle and had failed to provide the desired return on investment. The immigration of Jews to the region, it was hoped, would boost the local economy and help offset the cost of the railway. Finally, following the conclusion of the Second Boer War in 1902, the British were keen to secure Jewish support for their colonial policies in South Africa. On August 26, 1903, Theodor Herzl, founder of the modern Zionist movement, presented Chamberlain's scheme at the 6th World Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. Hertz assured the gathered delegates that the scheme would not interfere with the ultimate Zionist goal of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine and would instead provide a temporary refuge for Jews facing persecution in Eastern Europe. By a vote of 295 to 178, the Congress decided to send an investigatory commission to Uganda to evaluate the proposed territory for settlement. The commission, composed of British explorer Major Alfred Gibbon, Swiss Orientalist Alfred Kaiser, and Zionist engineer Nachum Wilbush, arrived in Gauss Negishu in December 1904. While their final report was ambiguous regarding the suitability of Uganda for Jewish settlement, the plan faced strong opposition from both sides on ideological grounds. Many Zionists considered the plan a betrayal of the Zionist program and an unnecessary distraction from their ultimate goal of establishing a Palestinian homeland. Meanwhile, white settlers in British East Africa protested the mass immigration of Jews into the region. As a result, the British government soon withdrew the offer, while the scheme was officially rejected by the Zionist movement at the Seventh World Congress in 1905. Undeterred, Congress members Nahum Sirkin and Israel Zangwill formed a separate territorialist movement to explore the resettlement of Jews to Canada, Australia, Mesopotamia, or Cyrenaica, today Iraq and Libya. However, strong opposition from local residents also scuppered these projects. One resettlement plan which did see some success, however, was the Galveston scheme, which, aided by American banker Jacob Schiff, saw some 9,300 Jews immigrate to southern Texas between 1907 and 1914. As anti-Semitism grew increasingly prevalent throughout the 1920s and 30s, Paul de Lagarde's ideas on forcibly deporting Europe's Jews to Africa, particularly Madagascar, came back into fashion. In 1937, the Polish government, with the assistance of France, sent a task force to Madagascar to evaluate the feasibility of Jewish resettlement. The task force reported that due to the climate and poor infrastructure, the islands could only accommodate a maximum of 5,000 to 7,000 families, and the plan was thus abandoned. Just a year later, however, the Madagascar plan was resurrected in, where else but Nazi Germany. Following the gradual disenfranchisement of German Jews via the Nuremberg laws and other anti-Semitic policies, the Nazis' initial final solution was simply to deport them elsewhere. However, few of Germany's neighbours were willing to accept their Jews. Indeed, in a meeting on December 9, 1938, French Foreign Minister Georges Bonnet informed German Foreign Minister Joachim de Ribbentrop of the French government's own wish to deport some 10,000 of its own Jews, preferably to Madagascar. However, the idea of overseas deportation was shelved once again following the 1939 invasion and occupation of Poland, which furnished Germany with a large neighbouring territory into which it could expel its Jewish population. Under the Nisko Plan, created by the Foreign Policy Office chief Alfred Rosenberg and SS Sturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann, Jews from Germany, Austria, and recently occupied Czechoslovakia and Poland would be transported to and concentrated within a 1,000 square kilometre area south of Lublin, Poland, known as the Lublin Reservation. Here, it was hoped the combination of overcrowding, poor land, and the conscription of Jews for forced labour would result in the eventual decimation and liquidation of the population. The first trainload of 2,700 Czech and Austrian Jews arrived in the Lublin Reservation on October 18, 1939. Though barracks were planned, none were completed, and the first deportees were left to fend for themselves in an open, swampy field with no water and little food. By April 1940, some 95,000 Jews had been transported to the area. Large numbers died of starvation, exposure, overwork, and diseases like typhus brought about by the cramped, unsanitary living conditions. However, the Nazis were soon forced to abandon the Nisko Plan, largely for pragmatic reasons. The trains used to transport deportees to the reservation were needed elsewhere for military purposes, while Hans Frank, head of the German government in German-occupied Poland, opposed the further influx of Jews into his district, claiming it had become too crowded. At the same time, the Nazi doctrine of Lebensraum, or living space, which had underpinned the invasion of Poland, was proving to be economically flawed, as the ethnic Germans resettled to areas cleared of native Poles and Jews found themselves with little to do. Finally, the deportation of Jews to Lublin was attracting international condemnation, prompting the Nazis to seek a less conspicuous method of solving the Jewish question. Following the Nazi invasion of France and the Low Countries on May 10, 1940, the idea of deporting Europe's Jews to Madagascar was resurrected once again. On June 3, 1940, Franz Rademacher, head of the Jewish department of the German Foreign Office, sent a memorandum to his superior, diplomat Martin Luther, proposing the deportation of all Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe to foreign territory. He initially considered Palestine as a destination, but quickly rejected this idea for fear of a strong Jewish state being established in the Middle East. Instead, he proposed Madagascar, the use of which could be added to the peace terms once France capitulated. The memorandum read in part, "The approaching victory gives Germany the possibility, and in my view also the duty, of solving the Jewish question in Europe. The desirable solution is all Jews out of Europe. In the peace treaty, France must make the island of Madagascar available for the solution of the Jewish question and to resettle and compensate the approximately 25,000 French citizens living there. The island will be transferred to Germany under a mandate. Diego Suarez Bay and the port of Anserrain, which are sea strategically important, will become German naval bases. In addition to these naval bases, suitable areas of the country will be excluded from the Jewish territory, Juden Territorium, for the construction of air bases. That part of the island, not required for military purposes, will be placed under the administration of a German police governor who will be under the administration of the Reichsführer SS. Apart from this, the Jews will have their own administration in this territory, their own mayors, police, postal and railroad administration, etc. The Jews will be jointly liable for the value of the island. For this purpose, their former European financial assets will be transferred for use to a European bank to be established for this purpose. Insofar as the assets are not sufficient to pay for the land which they will receive and for the purchase of necessary commodities in Europe for the development of the island, the Jews will be able to receive bank credits from the same bank. As Madagascar will only be a mandate, the Jews living there will not acquire German citizenship. On the other hand, the Jews deported to Madagascar will lose their citizenship of European countries from the date of deportation. Instead, they will become residents of the Mandate of Madagascar. Use can be made for propaganda purposes of this generosity shown by Germany in permitting cultural, economic, administrative, and legal self-administration to the Jews. It can be emphasized at the same time that our German sense of responsibility towards the world forbids us to make the gift of a sovereign state to a race which has no independent state for thousands of years. This would still require the test of history. Indeed, plans to this effect were already being made in other government departments. At the time, Hitler and the generals were preparing for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, which could potentially bring millions more Jews and other undesirables under German jurisdiction. As such a large mass of people could not be practically interred in Poland or anywhere else in mainland Europe, deportation overseas appeared a preferable solution. In a May 1940 memorandum concerning the treatment of the alien population in the East Reichsführer SS, Heinrich Himmler declared, quote, "I hope to see the term Jew completely eliminated through the massive immigration of all Jews to Africa or some other colony." Luther discussed Rademacher's proposal with the foreign minister Ribbentrop, whereupon it came to the attention of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, or RSHA. In January 1939, Heydrich had been appointed by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring to oversee the deportation of all Jews from German-occupied territory. He thus insisted that the implementation of Rademacher's plan fell under his jurisdiction. Thus, on August 15, 1940, Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann released a memorandum titled RSHA Madagascar Project, outlining the details of the scheme. Heydrich's plan called for the resettlement of 1 million Jews every year over a period of 4 years, with the entire island of Madagascar converted into a giant ghetto and police state administered by the SS. Hitler immediately approved the proposal. But while France surrendered unconditionally on June 22, 1940, the Madagascar plan could not immediately be implemented since the British Royal Navy controlled all the sea routes out of mainland Europe. Hitler hoped that after defeating the Royal Air Force and invading Britain in Operation Sea Lion, the British merchant fleet could be commandeered to transport Europe's Jews to Madagascar. But following the Luftwaffe's defeat in the Battle of Britain in September 1940, the Royal Navy remained in control of the seas, and the Nazis were forced to shelve the Madagascar plan once again. 2 years later, in May 1942, the Allies invaded Madagascar and placed the island under free French control, denying its use to the Germans. By this time, however, the Nazi program to make Europe Judenfrei, or free of Jews, had taken a far darker turn. At a conference in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee on January 20th, 1942, a delegation of German officials, including Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann, hammered out the details of the final solution to the Jewish problem: the systematic murder of all European Jews in purpose-built death camps.
After the Second World War, a common joke was that Adolf Hitler was the best general the Allies had ever had. His string of disastrous decisions, from the halting his forces around Dunkirk, delaying his invasion of Russia, and refusing to pull the Sixth Army out of Stalingrad, handed the advantage to his enemies time and time again, to the point that Operation Foxley, a 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler at his home in the Bavarian Alps, was cancelled for fear the Fuhrer would be replaced by a more competent leader. But while Hitler's military judgment was shaky from the start, it grew significantly worse as the war dragged on and the Fuhrer's mental and physical health sharply declined. In April of 1945, while Hitler was holed up in his Berlin Führer bunker as the Red Army closed into the city, SS Dr. Ernst Gunther Schenk remembered being shocked at the leader's condition, describing him as a living corpse, a dead soul. His spine was hunched, his shoulder blades protruded from his bent back, and he collapsed his shoulders like a turtle. I was looking into the eye of death. Shuffling and stumbling around like a man far older than his 56 years, his hands trembled so violently he could no longer write his own name, and his mood swung wildly between wild euphoria and unstoppable rage. The once vigorous leader of Nazi Germany had become a mental and physical wreck, a mere shell of his former self, whose irrational decisions likely helped end the Second World War far earlier than it would otherwise have. But what caused this dramatic collapse? For decades, historians and medical professionals have proposed a variety of candidates for Hitler's particular ailments, from Parkinson's to tertiary neurosyphilis. But there may be another even stranger explanation, and it all has to do with Adolf Hitler being extremely gassy. The Third Reich, as fanatically driven by ideology as it was always a mess of contradictions. Though Nazi ideology lionized the blonde, blue-eyed Aryan, few top Nazis, including Heinrich Himmler, Martin Bormann, Hermann Göring, Joseph Goebbels, and Hitler himself, remotely resembled this ideal. Even the infamous SS, the organization most obsessed with racial purity, eventually recruited entire legions of Muslims from the Balkans and Hindus and Sikhs from India into its ranks. But perhaps the most surprising contradiction of all was that Hitler's personal doctor, Theodor Morell, the man who arguably had the greatest and most intimate access to the Führer, was half Jewish. Born in 1886, the balding, overweight Morell served as a ship's doctor and army physician during World War I before establishing a general practice on Berlin's fashionable Kurfürstendamm Street. There he amassed a clientele of mainly wealthy high society patients whose mostly non-existent ailments responded well to flattery, homeopathy, and a variety of elaborate quack cures Morell concocted himself. Hitler met Morell by chance at a Christmas party in 1936, and while the doctor repelled the Führer's inner circle with his poor hygiene, repulsive body odor, and unpleasant demeanor, Hitler took an instant liking to him as he promised to cure one of the leader's most long-standing and embarrassing health complaints. Hitler had suffered from digestive issues his entire life, alternating between crippling bouts of stomach cramps, diarrhea, constipation, and uncontrollable flatulence, often forced him to leave official functions in a hurry. For a leader obsessed with image and expected to attend countless such functions and to deliver speeches in public, it was a serious problem. These issues prompted Hitler to become a vegetarian in the early 1930s, eliminating meat, milk, butter, and other rich foods from his diet in favor of vegetables and whole grains. But while this diet likely reduced the odor of Hitler's flatulence, the increased fiber intake only made the problem worse, eventually leading Hitler, who did not trust doctors, to seek out Dr. Morell's assistance. At first, Morell prescribed the Führer a medication called Mutaflor, a precursor to modern probiotics. Said to be made from the excrement of Bulgarian peasants of the most vigorous stock, the pills claimed to replace the bad gut bacteria of city living with the good bacteria of hard-working, clean-living country folk. While these pills seem tailor-made for Hitler's troubles, Morell owned stock in the company and prescribed them to all his patients, whether they had intestinal complaints or not. To accompany this treatment, Morell also prescribed Hitler 2 of Dr. Koester's anti-gas pills with every meal. At first, Hitler's flatulence did seem to become more intermittent, prompting the jubilant Führer to exclaim, "Nobody has ever before told me so clearly and precisely what is wrong with me. His method of cure is so logical that I have the greatest confidence in him. I shall follow this prescription to the letter." It is more than likely, however, that this improvement was merely the product of the placebo effect. For Hitler's bouts of intestinal distress tended to coincide with periods of high stress. Nonetheless, Morell had gained Hitler's confidence and become a valued member of his inner circle. But while Morell's medical interventions were initially limited to diet tips and gut pills, he soon began prescribing the Führer a dizzying array of enzymes, animal extracts, hormones, painkillers, sedatives, and stimulants, along with secret injections of his own concoction, which he vaguely described as containing vitamins. By 1941, Hitler was taking 63 different pills containing 92 different drugs at a rate of 150 pills per week. While Hitler's inner circle grew increasingly suspicious of Morell's quackery, Hitler continued to swear by him, the doctor traveling with the Führer everywhere he went, even as far as the Wolf's Lair, his forward headquarters in East Prussia. Meanwhile, Morell's high position in Nazi establishment allowed him to acquire pharmaceutical companies and conquer territories to mass-produce his various health tonics, netting him millions. Yet Morell's intense drug regime did little to improve Hitler's overall health, and as the Führer continued to suffer from bouts of intestinal distress, irritability, insomnia, and fatigue, Morell was forced to alternate between medications such as morphine and laxatives or stimulants and sedatives to keep his symptoms on an even keel. Among the first to suspect that Morell's drug cocktails, if not directly responsible for Hitler's ills, were at least making them worse, was Dr. Erwin Geising, who decided to actually examine the contents of the doctor's favorite anti-gas pills. What he discovered shocked him. The active ingredients on the tin included strychnine, commonly used as a rat poison, and atropine, another toxin used as a heart medication. While Morell had only prescribed 2 pills per meal, Hitler ate them like candy, taking as many as 6 at a time. Was it possible that Hitler was being slowly poisoned by his gut pills? When informed of the pill's contents, Hitler was unfazed, explaining, "I myself always thought they were just charcoal tablets for soaking up my intestinal gases, and I always felt rather pleasant after taking them." And despite Dr. Geising's dire warnings about the other drugs Morell was prescribing him, Hitler refused to listen, dismissing Geising for daring to contradict his favorite physician. In any case, an analysis of the pills revealed levels of strychnine and atropine too low to have any serious effect. So while the pills might not have been helping Hitler, they probably weren't hurting him either. Morell's daily vitamin injections, however, were a different matter entirely. By 1941, Hitler was receiving an injection in bed every morning as part of his daily routine. While Morell always maintained that his cocktail contained nothing but glucose and vitamins, Hitler's reaction to them tells a very different story. Within minutes, the injections would transform the Fuhrer from exhausted and groggy to alert, euphoric, and chatty, a state that lasted for several hours afterwards. This effect is consistent not with glucose, but amphetamines. Amphetamine use was common in Nazi Germany, German troops being issued a type of oral methamphetamine called Pervitin to increase alertness and stamina and reduce combat fatigue. It is believed that Pervitin was a key factor in allowing German forces to steamroll across France in only 6 weeks in the summer of 1940. However, it is now known that amphetamines are highly addictive, and as the war ground on and Germany's situation deteriorated, Hitler required larger and more frequent doses to overcome his body's tolerance to the drug. By 1944, Hitler was receiving 2 injections a day of 16 cc each, a 700-fold increase from when he first started. And with this increasing dependency came the classic symptoms of amphetamine abuse: insomnia, loss of appetite, euphoria, irritability, paranoia, impulsiveness, and wild mood swings, all of which severely affected his ability to make rational decisions in a time of crisis. In the final month of the war, this rigid, stubborn thinking led Hitler to issue endless, futile, no-retreat orders that resulted in hundreds of thousands of German troops being needlessly killed or captured. At the Battle of Stalingrad alone, 800,000 troops were killed and 90,000 marched off to captivity, where all but 6,000 perished. Heavy amphetamine use also took a toll on Hitler's body, with historians attributing his tremors and extreme weakness in his final days to a series of strokes or heart attacks, an extremely unlikely occurrence for a healthy 56-year-old. Given his terrible physical condition, it is likely that had he not killed himself on April 30th, 1945, Hitler would have died of another stroke or heart attack shortly thereafter. Theodor Morell remained at Hitler's side almost to the very end, spending the last days of the war holed up in the Führer bunker along with the rest of the Nazi high command. But on April 21st, 1945, Morell approached the Führer with one of his daily injections, only for Hitler to angrily fire him on the spot. While the rest of his inner circle had planned to flee to the Bavarian Alps, Hitler refused, insisting on remaining in his capital city and committing suicide before the Russians took over. Consequently, he grew paranoid that his subordinates, especially Morell, would conspire to drug him and spirit him away. The dismissal, however, came as a relief to Morell, who boarded an evacuation flight along with other Nazi officials and successfully managed to flee the city. He was captured by American forces in July, but after it was determined he had committed no war crimes, he was released. Hitler's eccentric, incompetent personal doctor lived on for another 3 years, finally dying of a stroke in May 1948. Wars and battles are never lost or won by a single factor, but seemingly small factors can have outsized effects. While it is likely that Nazi Germany's plans of European conquest were doomed from the start, the effects of Dr. Theodor Morell's injections on the Führer's mental and physical health led to a chain of increasingly poor decisions that ultimately hastened its demise. And all because Adolf Hitler farted like a horse. Now, how about a bonus fact? While the Nazis were perfectly happy to pump their soldiers and even their beloved Führer full of meth and cocaine, there was one stimulating substance that they did not tolerate, and that was caffeine. Strange as it may seem, the Third Reich was one of the first large-scale adopters of the relatively new invention of decaffeinated coffee, whose consumption was promoted as official government policy. Nazi doctrine called for citizens to adopt a healthy, natural lifestyle in order to produce a stronger, more virile Aryan race, encouraging them to exercise regularly and avoid alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine. and decaf coffee was the ideal tool with which to promote these ideals. The first decaffeination process was developed 30 years earlier by Ludwig Roselius, who discovered that a shipment of coffee beans which had become soaked in seawater had somehow been stripped of its caffeine. After patenting the process in 1905, Roselius founded his own company, Coffee Hog, which sold decaffeinated coffee under the brand name Sanka, short for the French sans caffeine. While Sanka sold well throughout the 1910s and 1920s, it wasn't until the rise of the Nazis that its popularity truly took off, the product being promoted in official propaganda and served in large quantities at Nazi rallies, festivals, and other government-sponsored events. But not all of this success was strictly due to the government involvement. Despite their best efforts, Nazi attempts to reduce smoking and alcohol consumption were unsuccessful, and it is likely that Sanka's popularity was due more to its status as a luxury product than its supposed health benefits. And if the irony of the Nazis shunning coffee while embracing meth wasn't enough, Roselius' decaffeination process left behind traces of benzene, a far more toxic substance than caffeine, even in small quantities. Whatever the reason for its popularity, after the war, Sanka and other brands of decaf coffee became worldwide bestsellers, taking their place alongside Fanta as an unexpectedly long-lived culinary legacy of the Third Reich.